Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and as we're continuing on Chris Chan's internet presence kick for the next couple of videos, I have to draw each and every one of you to a little bit of, oh no, here we go, not this. Well, it is a little bit like that, and I think now's just the time to explain. You see, because I've been making, I'll have to give a little bit of an autobiography to this one, so I apologize in advance. I'll keep this as brief as possible. I've been making content on the internet since 2018, nearly 8 whole years, and during that time, I've never had any sorts of conflicts or issues or people try to stir things or been involved in any sort of controversies online. Now, the reason why that's the case is because you kind of grow to accept that, guess what, it's not a good idea to start problems, accidentally or otherwise. It's very, very important to maintain that level of parasociability, as I'm going to phrase it, from what you do and how you interact in the rest to the rest of the world. And it means not really getting too involved, because when you get too involved, you're liable to take a certain perspective when certain things do go wrong. For instance, there's a very divisive YouTuber here in the UK who goes by the name Charlie Veach. Now, for those who don't know who Charlie Veach is, he sort of started the craze of UK auditors, and to be fair, I do a little bit of stuff like that here and there. If you want to know more, let me know and I'll tell you what the score is in the comment section. Now, Charlie Veach has had a very, very polarizing display towards quite a lot of YouTubers, culminating in, amongst many other things, some rumor about him being banned from the city of Manchester, because Manchester, England is where he started making videos, and some of the things Charlie Veach says are very, very open, but some of them do rival the uncomfortable barrier of being incredibly blasé. Now, why is that an issue, you may be asking? Because even if Charlie Veach was absolutely correct, and whether Charlie Veach was really correct in his opinions one way or the other, is a question that would certainly will be brought into prominence one of these days. The problem is that some of the things I do agree, but some of them come across as incredibly blasé and a little bit unfair in the grand scheme of things. For instance, just this past week, he did a video where he was in Winter Gardens just outside of Orlando in Florida, and he was talking about what a difference being in Florida really is being compared to the UK, because he said there's no banner boys, there's no people wielding machetes in their pants. You know, he was listing off quite a lot of very negative things, and to be honest, has a very marginalized, a very niche sort of part of the UK. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. However, that's like really, really small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. And then, like, the very next day, he was back in the UK and he was traveling through Cambridge. And he spent pretty much the entire video saying how Cambridge is literally a cooking pot filled to the brim of lefties, wokists, Antifa, leftoids, as he calls them, and pretty much he spends the entire video talking about it, and he brings up things like the famous five, which were like Cambridge postgraduates who sort of exiled themselves to the Soviet Union, they sold secrets, etc., etc., etc. I don't know the full details, but yeah, he spends pretty much 30 whole minutes slagging off the left while he's in Cambridge. Now, which, to be honest, does seem a little unfair, but I think part of the reason is to bait engagement. And the problem when you bait engagement, ladies and gentlemen, is that you do draw attention to yourself when you do stuff like that. And when you draw attention to yourself with issues that are incredibly divisive, you sort of split yourself into two groups. Detractors and also white knights. Which neatly brings us on to the issue of Chris, which is a little bit more of a grey area, at least at one point when it came to the issue of white knights, A-logs, stuff like that. But maybe one of these days I'll do a little bit of a pre-long video talking about Charlie Veach, because he's not necessarily a lolcow, but he's also one of those people I do want to talk about when it comes to, like, let's say, internet elocution and internet just sort of how you go about on the internet, and stuff, like how you carry yourself, that sort of thing. Because Charlie Veach is probably the most American British person I've ever seen in my life, despite the fact that he's half Brazilian. But that's we can take it or leave it. In the meantime, let's talk about Chris and his relationship with White Knights. Have we got it? Good. Okay. Pro tip. As good as your intentions may be, there is no conceivable way any old E-friend can reach out to Chris at this point and change him for the better. Certainly not by continuing to ass-pat and pamper him. In light of recent events where Chris got kicked out of a furry convention, I'll be talking about that in a couple of days' time anyway, once like all details have been finalized, if you will, which is precisely what messed him up so badly in the first place, as this wiki evidences copiously. Chris blocked me too. We defend her, buy from her, and encourage her, a truly repulsive person. Former White Knight David 906379747. Meanwhile, White Knights, during the Miscreants era, were subverted. The messages blocked, deleted before Chris could see them. If they got through, trolls would leak their conversations with Chris and accuse the helper of being the culprit. And this comes from Marvin, aka the man in the pickle suit. White knighting is a term used to describe the act of going onto the internet to help or defend someone else against other people, out of pity or compassion or for ulterior motives. Or maybe they share a common interest, that sort of thing. People who do this are often referred to as white knights. White knighting of Chris is especially prevalent because of the sheer volume of abuse he's taken ever since the internet found his Encyclopedia Dramatica page in 2007. Thanks to events following from the idea guys, most white knights now fall into a subgroup referred to as anti-trolls. Those who try to ward off other trolls and Tetrad members away from Chris to have him for themselves, rather than for noble purposes. These are not to be confused with the other subgroup of white knights, counter-trolls, who primarily fight against trolls to protect Chris, rather to troll him themselves. Counter-trolls are those who take Chris's side to spite his trolls. Some do this because trolling one gullible idiot is less satisfying than trolling the trolls, who actually have the ability to understand what is going on. Others have decided that Chris has jumped the shark and are trying to make everyone else leave him alone to put a stop to an old meme, which is effectively gatekeeping. This was especially prevalent, ladies and gentlemen, during about the beginnings of 2019, where Chris was where Chris really was sort of going off the deep end with beliefs of the dimensional merge, and that the whole of reality was going to clash with a fictionalized cartoon universe. So, and this was during a relatively quiet time in Chris's life, despite the fact that coverage about him was busier than ever before. Certainly before I started talking about him, at any rate. In the broader internet trolling community, a wide range of people, from neutral observers to even his greatest trolls, are accused of being white knights. This is mostly due to Chris's fans discouraging weaning, enabling, and A-logging, acts which, to outside observers, could be misinterpreted as an attempt to reduce trolling. So when the label white knight gets thrown around, take it with a grain of salt. A meta-topic within the broader Chris saga has been the merits of attempting to help Chris stop being a lolcow. That's good, and whether he is deserving of such assistance, or even beyond help. Opinion on that matter is somewhat divided on whether Chris is capable of improvement. Probably not, but we'll see for ourselves in time. Although most agree that if Chris is going to improve, it will not be in any large part due to the efforts of third parties who only interact with him over the internet. Some believed that Chris was improving on his own, albeit slowly and in small increments. That's good, as seen in his gradual abandonment of his homophobia. Also good that he's, just, he didn't really he just sort of kind of stopped mentioning it, and the only time he ever did bring it up again is when he said sorry in the most pitifully, oh, I'm sorry, move on, way you can imagine. Which began with him declaring tolerance for lesbians, which he eventually extended to gay men. Others believe that Chris had not tangibly improved and that he was merely moved sideways rather than forward. Chris showed signs of improving from mid 2015, having found a new hangout, also presumably avoiding jail. Though in the case of Chris narrowly avoiding jail for his pepper spray incident, I will say on that front, Chris just kind of moved on from it. He moved on from it without even pretending to have learned anything from it. He just sort of stopped bringing it. Chris sometimes can be one of those people that all will be forgiven as long as Chris doesn't actually have to say sorry for anything he's done. This could be evidenced by the fact that once Chris was out on a 2,000, I think it was like a $2,500 bail, Chris went straight home. This was just before 2015, and went on Facebook and posted an extremely long tirade defending his actions and his rationale. So yeah, his first response, as soon as he got a little bit of freedom, was to say, "It's not my fault." When it was. And this wasn't even something that was orchestrated by the trolls or anything like that. This was something that Chris started completely on his own, where it seemed he was finally making friends and improving his social skills. Moreover, he finally found a way to cash in on his e-fame, delighted his fan base by resuming the comics, and made his dreams of a solitary media empire a reality, albeit probably on a much smaller scale than he once envisaged. Since Chris's arrest for incest in 2021, and isn't that a sentence, many of his white knights abandoned him, and he is now at the mercy of A-logs and weens. The reason why is because it's not really one of those things where you can really defend it. Quite a lot of the perception, if you will, of white knighting is that white knights understand the context, more or less, of who they're dealing with. And when you put that into perspective, do you really want to defend yourself or defend someone who, and I quote, has had multiple runs in with the law, has assaulted somebody, has committed incest, has frequently lied to his fan base, has set fire to his house, albeit by an accident, but it was an accident waiting to happen, and acted completely irresponsibly and has done absolutely nothing to... What I'm trying to say is that, are you really sure you want to be spending your time doing this? Because, again, if it's not to help Chris, then what is it for? Because how exactly can you help somebody who can't help themselves? You tell me. Where that puts Flutter is a really, really good question. But let's crack on, shall we? Motifs. Pity/remorse. Following the release of Chris's first nudes and the video in which he reacted to the loss of his medallions in Blanca Weiss, many people, including trolls, felt sorry for him. They had not expected it to be possible for him to be trolled so hard, or for him to appear so shattered. I'm sure that Chris crashing out into slumber was certainly a very low point in his life, but at no point, even when Chris was just sort of lying sideways saying the pickle man tricked me again, you would have thought that Chris might have, I don't know, learned something from this experience. Well, he didn't, and Chris continued to not do that for many, many years. Empathy. The internet is full of autistic people, man-children, and self-absorbed morons. Many of them are right here. Fascinated with Chris. All of them see something of themselves in him, whether it's his obesity, you could probably fit at least 2 people in that, his all-consuming need for female companionship, same problem, or for his fervent belief that his homemade comics matter. probably to Chris, but not really to anyone else, a lot of White Knights have made at least some of the mistakes Chris has made and have since wised up. They think they can help Chris by offering the benefit of their experience, which is, it's certainly noble in theory. Unfortunately, it's not really our choice as to make Chris listen or make Chris come to some sort of understanding as to, well, there is something to be gained from what can only be described as humiliating experiences to trolls. Circumstances beyond Chris's control. Chris fails to identify people, a possible sign of proxenoxenosia. Julie and her brother Max used the same voice, yet Chris couldn't recognize that they were the same person. Love You Long Time played numerous real-life characters, and yet Chris fell for every one of them. Pictures of different women were used to depict Blanca, and yet Chris thought that they were the same person. Chris believed that pictures of Megan Fox were of Vanessa Hudgens. In high school, Chris memorized his appearance in the mirror because he had trouble recognizing himself. Since he's never updated his self-image, apart from get slightly older, this is a possible explanation as to why he denies being overweight. He has an issue distinguishing things. Do you think that's also a way to describe proxenoxenosia? Is that it's a difficulty in distinguishing what could count as overweight, underweight, what counts as somebody looking slightly different from each other, even if like two of the same images were shown? Well, I don't exactly know what the answer to that is. However, it's got to be some sort of distinction, I suppose. Chris's autism also means that he thinks and sees the world in simplistic binary terms. He cannot easily read between the lines or detect sarcasm, or particularly any kind of nuance or subtlety. He's interpreted Family Guy as actually being against homosexuality. When two male acquaintances at the gameplays exchanged sarcastic homosexual remarks, Chris concluded that they were gay. It is also thought that his decision to go tomgirl was at least partially due to him taking advice to get in touch with his feminine side. Literally. Well, with that being said, mind you, I'm not too certain of get in touch with your feminine side also results to hurling insults at people who just so happen to be transgender, or for that matter, deciding to babble into the realms of hate speech, which Chris did only a few short months after, quote unquote, becoming a tomgirl. As far as the rest of the world was concerned, Chris was still the same person on the inside. It was only on outward appearance that everybody must have thought Chris must have transformed overnight. The trolls are even worse people than Chris. Another frequently heard line of reasoning is that the trolls have gone way too far, and have demonstrated that they're even worse than Chris, or at least equally pathetic. Not entirely untrue, that is. For example, Blue Spike's sadistic abuse of his control over Chris outraged even the trolls. The same can be said for the Idea Guys, who convinced Chris to do some extremely degrading things, permanently damaged his way of thinking, and even tried extorting him. The less sophisticated bulk of the trolling was the work of A-logs and weens, who are frowned upon even by trolls, and rightfully so. And of course, who really has no life here? Chris, or the people who obsessively document and debate everything he does. Yeah, that's it's a very difficult one to dispute the other way. But with that being said, the trolls knew when to stop. Not all of them, but many of the trolls did know when to stop. The original miscreants, for example, when Chris's father died, they decided, yeah, we're not going to do this anymore, and they abandoned Chris merely out of respect for his dad, and that, things weren't really ever going to be the same again after that. Others, however, thought that there was just ways of doing it because Chris could be exploited in such a way. And if it wasn't for, the helps of people like the Captain, Marvin, and Noel, they probably would have still been going, circa the Idea Guys. But with that being said, there There's also, I think it's just because I know people will know fine well is that if trolls emerge on the scene, they will be caught out one way or another with information that would be damning and could potentially damage their reputation in the real world when they're sort of not being surrounded by people who encourage this sort of behavior. But welcome to the internet. Attention whores. Some of these white knights, the aforementioned anti-trolls, desperately seek attention from the community that surrounds Chris, sometimes faking their protecting of Chris. A lot like enablers, these people cannot contribute anything to society and therefore will never get a Wikipedia page of their own. Not necessarily the worst thing in the world to happen, but that's besides the point. So the Quickie or Geno's documentary series is the next best alternative. White knights with attention on their mind often pretend that they are protecting Chris for noble purposes, when in actuality are trying to gain confirmation from the community through morally questionable techniques. So, for example, buying Chris a brand new Nintendo Switch in the means to gain their approval, and, well, yeah, we all know how well that turned out. Presumably, the other questionable thing as well is, well, again, you do realize what sort of person we're dealing with, and Chris can at times be presented as particularly ungrateful. Not all the time, but most of the time, Chris is can be presumed as very ungrateful. However, these sorts of things have sort of died away in recent times. And before anybody says that's just me, well, again, I keep myself at a very, very safe distance. And it means my involvement in the whole Chris Chan's story is merely just to relay information and then give a little bit of my input. Honestly, it does not go any further than that, because going any further than that is really, really suspicious, even amongst people for whatever reason are keeping this tugboat afloat. I'm quite proud of myself for doing that. Arguments against white knighting. Perhaps you feel like you have a good case in trying to befriend and help Chris. Maybe you feel like you have a solid plan that to truly help break Chris out of his godlike delusions, and or actually take steps in improving his life, all without any sort of ill intent whatsoever. The only sorts of people I imagine that would fit into this category are for those who probably don't use social media, probably don't even go onto the internet, only people very, very local to Chris and don't really know the full context. Like, we're talking on a cordial neighborhood kind of like approach. Kind of like how, I get along with my neighbors and stuff like that, but I don't tell them, what I do and stuff like that. I tell them what I do for a day job and stuff like that, and we just have like very gentle back and forth conversations, stuff like that. And yeah, because it doesn't really need to go any further than that. It's just one of those things. I don't tell them about their life stories, although, to be honest, maybe it would be good. It would be good to know a little bit more, because it's quite the street has quite a lot of elderly people on it, and we had a bit of an incident last night where an ambulance pulled out outside a house like round the corner. The old lady lives in there. She's 94 years of age, and yeah, it's one of those things. However, no matter how good your intentions may be, you shouldn't even bother trying to do this, and there are many reasons why. 1. Chris is beyond your ability to help at this point. The trolls that allegedly wanted to teach Chris some unpleasant truths about life, along with previous white knights who wanted to shield Chris from criticism, while genuinely wanting to prepare him for the real world, have consistently come to the conclusion that Chris is simply incorrigible. Nothing helpful that anyone says or does has actually stuck with Chris in any long-term capacity. While he is more than willing to pick up more harmful habits, even though the closest person who Chris had to a friend since the trolling began, and was the only advisor that Chris would actually listen to, came to the conclusion that Chris not only refuses to learn anything if it slightly inconveniences him, but that he is actively malicious and will ignore you or betray you if your trust, if it benefits him. Or as Noel put it, as long as he gets away with it, that is literally all that matters to him. Even medical professionals are believed to have a hard time helping Chris, particularly when considering that Chris was just a delusional, if not more so, after 3 months of time in a psychiatric hospital, as he was going in. While Chris is a victim of circumstance, and that is certainly true, he can only get help if he actually seeks it. And that feels like extremely wishful thinking at this point. Because guess what? The help Chris would receive would be being told the truth. And nothing turns Chris off more than being told the truth about himself. White knighting Chris now takes on a completely different connotation. An unfortunate shift in the character of Chris's internet adversaries has developed in the Idea Guys' wake. Having caused Chris to believe himself married and as a goddess, traditionally methods of reaching to Chris as pretending to be a boyfriend-free girl have become obsolete. And in recent times there have been an overwhelmingly number of people who are confident that playing make-believe with Chris will either help him in the long run or will turn them into trolling legends. Which is a really stupid practice, ladies and gentlemen. So yeah, you don't do that just for that reason alone. Think about how that sounds. Because of this newfound confidence built by playing make-believe with Chris, it has been abused several times, and likewise became the means of weeding them out, regardless of their intentions. White knighting as a whole has taken on a much more negative connotation in the Christian community than it ever has before. Protecting Chris from specific trolls does not automatically make you a hero in the Chris Chan saga. It goes without saying, but just because you divert trolls away from Chris doesn't exclude you from being a subject of critique, as you have involved yourself in the drama in the first place. No matter the intention, interacting with Chris has always been discouraged by the community surrounding him. Chris's story doesn't really have any heroes in it. Anyways, it can basically be described as a sad tale of villains, victims, victims who became villains, villains who became victims, and those who watched the whole story play out. White knighting Chris is also not worth the stress. In order to get close to Chris, White Knights have to spend at least as much time and effort as trolls to keep up to date on his activities. Most have to lie and pretend to be a goddess of another dimension or a random OC to even capture his undivided attention. This, combined with Chris's habit of pushing away anyone who tries to connect with him, is enough to make any sane non-psychologist crash into slumber. A key example of this is the enabler MKR, who frequently came into conflicts with Jacob Sockness and his other enabling ilk while trying to warn Chris of the danger of letting Sockness get too close. Though for narcissistic reasons, as to some extent MKR simply wanted to keep Chris to herself, regardless of whether they're white knighting for their own gain or out of some misguided effort to help Chris, white knights will find themselves experiencing unprecedented levels of stress. This is one of the reasons why many simply give up. Though even in the case of Jacob Sockness, whilst he was still relatively being mentioned within the Christian narrative, had sort of given up the idea roundabout when both Chris and Jacob had a bit of a falling out in late 2019, and by Chris's incarceration, Jacob Sockness had completely abandoned ship or had just served orders to quit and got on to whatever else was out there. You'll notice this because Jacob Sockness has literally not been involved in the story for, well, I'm going to say at least 6 years, for what it's worth, because do you really think Sockness was worth mentioning, or, well, I don't think it was worth the stress. Not that I think Sockness seemed to care one way or the other, but that's besides the point. It's also why no prevalent figures, maybe apart from Flutter, and Flutter can't really be described as a white knight, because it's really hard to categorize Flutter as anything outside of maybe some representation of a legal guardian. But then again, even that's a little bit of a complicated process. Chris will not even read your message. For a long period of time, trolls had control over his emails. Messages sent to him by White Knights are often deleted before he could read them. Even back in the days of the mailbag, any emails submitted to it, even if they got published, would have been given one-word replies and ignored. Like I said before, even when people would write to the mailbag, and even if their things were harsh, were undisputably true, do you really think Chris has much to say when it comes to the truth about things? I don't think so. Being overly nice to Chris might have molded him badly and still does, enabling basically. Tempting as it may seem to feel sympathetic for Chris, despite certain events, doing so would only benefit him for all the wrong reasons. Chris's youth wasn't one without acts of kindness from others, albeit mainly people who were well-meaning yet misguided, at best, or flat-out spoiled him at worst. As a result of others genuinely opting to shield Chris from even the slightest negativity, with a few attempts at genuine advice going in one ear and straight out the other. He has grown accustomed to receiving, or expecting to receive, nothing but complete satisfaction with no strings attached from anyone who gives him the time of day. Not only has it led to Chris's tendency to become hostile to anyone trying to show him the error of his ways, and of course doesn't give him everything he wants, but it has also allowed opportunities for enablers to entertain his bizarre delusions, only making him worse than he was before his online infamy. To make matters worse, it has even effectively created a paradox where benefiting Chris prevents him from getting what would actually benefit him, i.e., therapeutic aid he needs but refuses. So even the best of intentions will ultimately yield no positive results whatsoever. Because Chris refuses to learn from anything that's gone on, Chris also, again, refuses to accept reality in all its forms. I'll discuss a lot of these in greater detail when we come to Chris and his attitudes towards reality. Chris can't or won't, probably both, ever learn his lesson no matter what you tell him. Due in no small part to the fact that Chris has been mollycoddled by his parents from the very beginning and had his hand held through school by teachers who were sympathetic to a fault, he is flat out resistant to any harsh truths pointing out his countless shortcomings and the objective fact that the general public by and large isn't going to absolve him of responsibility for his antics. If they did, you would drive literally every police department all over the world out of business if we just sort of let bygones be bygones. Because not everybody of the general public are nearly as sympathetic or forgiving. He will not take a moment to reflect on his actions, let alone use memories of these experiences to avoid repeating the same mistakes ever again, because he is thoroughly convinced that he is a righteous victim of an unfair society that horribly mistreats autistics. Thus, anyone who goes against his ideals, i.e., denies him what he feels entitled to have, sometimes at the time, sometimes not, is an irredeemable villain in his eyes. As such, he won't accept any words that don't match what he believes in and or wants to hear. So even simply trying to be nice and reasoning with Chris won't convince him that you're not a dang dirty troll. Even ignoring the numerous altercations Chris got into during his love quest, resulting in portraying authorities doing their jobs as one-dimensional villains for him and his league of OCs to triumph over, and the brutally honest tongue lashing he's received in many a phone call. A particularly notable example of a White Knight unable to make Chris wake up and smell the coffee was none other than Vivian G. After 3 hours of trying just to do that, she eventually gave up, understandably equating the experience with fighting a wall. Fighting a wall with a medallion would probably be better suited to it. Now, supposing that Chris does consider you to be trustworthy, that still doesn't necessarily mean he will benefit from your attempts to help him. Now, a good example of this would be Rocky Shoemaker, who he considered to be better than a much needed therapist, yet consistently failed to follow just about every word of advice she gave him. Her best efforts to prevent trolling schemes notwithstanding, going back even further, Chris fondly remembered Vivian Janine Sanford being his favourite middle school teacher, proclaiming to her to be the most influential person of his life, who taught him better social skills, how to deal with bullies, and so forth. He even kept her parting message advising him how to avoid showing others his weak points. And yet, judging by the fact that this mere wiki exists, he obviously never took such words to heart. In short, as long as your words are not 100% in line with his childlike and egocentric point of view, it's utterly futile to try and help Chris. Besides these, there are slightly more niche sort of examples, so let's begin with YouTube. Among the most notable of Chris's white knights was a YouTube counter-troll who claimed to be a 21-year-old Russian model named Zvenka, via her YouTube account Hottie96. She released an inordinate number of screen caps from troll conversations on Sonichu IRC, including private conversations between Chris and Panda Halo. She also released an image of the man in the pickle suit who would later steal Chris's first date, Emily. Were Chris less thick-skulled and even slightly willing to accept irrefutable evidence, Zvenka may have made somewhat of a negative impact on the organized trolling effort against Chris, but ultimately she was ineffectual. Zvenka also had an unhealthy obsession with the Quickville Library's original creator, Arjun van Dieverton. On the 6th of May 2009, YouTuber user xthexpinch x/north x*7 the Pinchester bomb tried to blackmail major trolls, claiming to have information on them. He was easily called on his bluff by someone who had not trolled Chris at all. The Pinch has also threatened Blue Sky, saying he has information from his friends, forgetting the fact that Blue Spike has no friends, even to this very day. Facebook. From 2012 until 2017, Chris took to using Facebook as a means of expressing himself. Inevitably, this has not only attracted the attention of trolls, but in 2013, a slew of white knights as well. In particular, William Elliot Waterman, who taunted the trolls to come after him instead of Chris. Spoiler alerts, nobody did because nobody actually cared what he had to say. Maybe it was a bit of a noble attempt, but at the same time, I don't think that's the reason why the trolls come round to people in the first place. However, as we've come to expect of Chris, anyone who tells him something he doesn't want to hear are people that needed to be brushed off until they stop saying those mean, awful things to him. A good case in point is his anger-laced tirade in September 2013, when he got thrown out of Walmart and started calling names. The White Knights typically chimed in with their support until he revealed that he vandalized an Xbox One display in the store. Several of them had told Chris that he was not in the right for him to do that, and that the manager had every right to throw him out. What was Chris's response? They do not. And if they do, they are the most in the wrong, because they have the most abusive and overzealous of their authoritative power that has never existed. Yeah, and you're just sort of, that's ridiculous, is the way to put that. Chris was lucky he didn't face, a visit from the police following this. TV tropes. The TV tropes article on Sonichu used to have a white knight message on the first text of the article, with a link back to this very page. It was eventually removed due to TV Tropes' website policy changing later on. In other words, said message would no longer be allowed on the website. The message is reproduced down below. Hey Chris, if you're reading this, you seriously need to get help from licensed professionals before the stuff you do gets you thrown into prison or forcibly committed. And we're sorry, but you have no real fans. The people you think are your fans are really either trolls or laughing at you behind your back. Every last one. Please listen to us. For once. Unfortunately, the editor in question fails to realize that their message while well-intentioned, will do absolutely nothing, and Chris will simply ignore it even if he does fully read and input it for better development. Thank you for your time. In another move that was appeared to be White Knight-ish to onlookers was that the page was also locked in order to prevent Weens and A-logs from derailing a page about Chris's stupid webcomic to instead flood it with a trope list covering his entire life, with entries on Chris and the effort to troll him taking up about 2/3 of the page as a result of overzealous editors piling on an easy target instead of talking about the comic itself. However, the mods took action not out of a desire to protect Chris, but because troping a creator in such a fashion was strictly prohibited, and going into Chris's life in such detail constituted an invasion of privacy. That was in direct violation of the site's rules. The subsequent cleanup led to several Sonotube-related pages being locked, with the main page covering the work getting a milquetoast and somewhat insincere message explaining that the article was being locked over excessive negativity, rather than the page flagrantly being warped by its editors to serve a different purpose than what the site was actually made for. Some Sonotube pages were eventually unlocked and the message was eventually removed, with the goal of actually providing examples of tropes in Sonotube being realized. However, following the incest reveal, the pages were locked once more, and all discussion of Chris's personal life was prohibited on the threat of suspension. The site even toyed around the possibility of removing all of the Sonotube articles and forum threads, but ultimately chose to begrudgingly keep them up. A recreation of what the page looked like before being overhauled by the mods of TV tropes can be seen round about here, which I'll tell you what, we'll keep that open because it would have been a little bit interesting to see what it did look like. Chris as a White Knight himself. In 2017, Chris began trying to White Knight the crew of Planet Dolan, particularly creator Doopy Doover, after he misinterpreted one of Doopy's tweets about being tired of harassment from Chris himself as referring to trolls harassing her. To this end, he started the trend #HarassQuickDirectly campaign, in which he exhorted the supported trolls to take aim at him and leave Doopy and friends right alone. This might have been a misguided effort to win Doopy's affections, after she emphasized that she considers him nothing more than a mere customer, not even as a friend. Eventually, this campaign, combined with his overfamiliar behavior towards her, would earn Chris a block from Doopy later that year. He also bizarrely White Knighted himself in May of 2020, while LARPing as Mewtwo, his second husband. Note that he did so as a brief interruption of his marathon session as LARPing as Sonichu. And if none of that made any sense to you, welcome to Chris Chan in 2020. Nothing made any sense. But what does make sense, ladies and gentlemen, is very, very simply, don't get involved with Chris. Because there's a difference between defending somebody from bullies and knowing exactly who you are defending. Sometimes in life, ladies and gentlemen, and I've said this once, and I'll say it 1,000 times more, sometimes you have got to know exactly what it is you're getting yourself into. And that's why even talking about this sort of stuff, you have to treat with a fair amount of caution. Not that I suspect anyone would suspect me of being a White Knight anytime soon. I keep away from stuff like that because guess what? I am very, very comfortable in my lane. I know what my lane is. You don't. It's like in wrestling, ladies and gentlemen. You would not attempt a move you've never ever done before in the middle of a well-rehearsed sequence of events, because if something goes wrong, somebody is going to get really, really hurt. There's reasons why these things are in place, and therefore that's what we stick to, because not because we're used to them, but because they work for the reasons intended. However, that's not quite the end when we talk about Chris's internet presence, because oh boy, is there a lot more to cover. But with that being said, I will see all of you guys again next time. Thank you. Good evening, ladies. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome back to another one, Chris Chan quickie article. And as this cycle of Chris's internet efficacy continues, we now have to move on to talk about probably one of the most annoying little pests when it comes to enablers, carpetbaggers, white knights. Technically there's five, and we'll get to those. And A-logs are pretty annoying as well. Weens, however, I think are probably even more annoying, and you're about to find out why. Are you 6 years old or something? Bob Chandler outsmarting a ween attempting to prank call Chris. I won't bother trying to suggest fill in the blanks about what Bob says afterwards, but if you want to take a guess, I think it's the beginning of part part 21, I think, of Chris Chan, A Comprehensive History, if you want to know what he said afterwards. Don't worry about those weens. You know you are safe around me and my loves. Smiley face, lightning, hot lightning. Chris attempting to persuade a fan who won't be hassled by them at BronyCon. Weening, or fail trolling, is the act of attempting to troll someone, but ultimately failing in the whole way through, the whole way through, and not receiving any significant results, typically due to inexperience with lolcow culture. The people that do this are often referred to as weens, not to be confused with the alternative rock band. A corruption of the phrase epic win, weens are wannabe trolls, who attempt to recreate the antics of prominent trolls without being aware that there was much more manipulation behind the scenes to goad Chris into performing for the trolls, and therefore just embarrassing themselves. You think we're exaggerating? Maybe some videos will get the point across, and well, if you want to see these for yourselves, because unfortunately there's quite a lot of not very nice things said in these, but again, I'll leave that to your imagination. Anyways, examples of weaning. Trolls' plans, no matter how elaborate, that end up failing. Taking advantage of Chris by pretending to white knight him, the Quick Protect squad is a notorious example of this. Prank calling Chris or his mother Barbara, double dumbass points if it's just to yell, Julie, Julie, or Ian Brandon Anderson something, or other ancient memes. Prank takeaway deliveries under Chris's name and address. Not only is this just annoying for anyone involved, on top of wasting both money and food, but numerous restaurants in Chris's area, namely Papa John's, have blacklisted his address precisely to prevent this. A-logging. While not all weens are A-logs and vice versa, the two often overlap. A-log himself was as much as a ween as your average A-log in numerous ways. Enabling Chris's fantastical beliefs. Chris's mind is already messed up on its own merits, and people such as the Idea Guys have done more than enough mental damage to him. Once again, while not all weens are enablers and vice versa, they tend to overlap. Making fake Facebook and Twitter profiles of people that Chris follows exclusively. Spamming Chris's Facebook pages with random pictures of his old triggers to try and get a rouse out of him, such as of pickles, homosexuals, or Sonic's redesign in Sonic Boom. Scathing emails, letters, this goes on by the way, so I apologize, or social media messages. It may just be plain sad to say, but even telling Chris to get a job has become ween lingo. Butting into conversations Chris is having with other people online, especially if he isn't doing anything particularly wrong at the moment, which is almost 99% of the time. This was sadly way too common with the Doopy Do-Over saga. Attempting to contact people who once interacted with Chris, but have since cut off all ties with him. This includes, but not limited to, Megan Schroeder, Joseph Cole-Smithy, The Wallflower, Merrily Walsh, Adam Stackhouse, Michael Snyder, etc., and drag them back into the spotlight against their wishes. Terrible fanfiction and fan art that wittily deconstructs Sonichu and where it takes place as a saccharine dystopia. Sorry folks, but Aspachu, A Girl That Brought Down the World, Sonichu the Animated Series, and the Quick Collateral not only already did this, but have also milked the concept for everything it's worth. Double dumbass points if your fan work is even more grotesque, gory, or perversive than Sonichu already is. as seen in the picture below right. Triple dumbass points if focusing predominantly on the slaughter of Sonnies and Rosies. Mass reporting in an attempt to get Chris his social media accounts shut down. Spouting tired old Chris memes in places where Christorians lurk, or even in places where most of the members don't even know about Chris. Either way, it's very annoying and takes up a lot of people's time. Spoiling Chris's legitimate attempts at doing commissions and participating in contests or e-commerce. This extends to making frivolous or exaggerated claims of Chris's misconduct in feedback on sites like eBay or YouTube. Sending unwanted mail to Chris's address like glitter bombs and letters for PewDiePie. Making terrible rap songs about Chris. Harassing bronies whose content I should say, Chris enjoys into blocking him on Twitter. Recreating his Wikipedia page as a social experiment. Spamming his tweets with, "Where's the comics?" He's not going to respond, so don't even try. Hacking into Chris's YouTube account to upload a video of someone screaming, "July!" Sending letters to Chris to persuade him into saying or doing things while under the belief that he is Jesus. Translating Ian Brand Anderson into a writing system Chris doesn't understand and telling him it's a blessing in another language. Writing a fake letter, claiming it to be sent by Chris in an undisclosed location and directing it towards another locale. Funding a pornographic film about Chris. I'll give it that much. I've never heard that one before. Leaving 1-star reviews on places Chris has visited because Chris has visited them. Suggesting Chris should start an OnlyFans. Making fake obituaries stating Bob or any other historical figures had died. Chasing down Chris and trying to shove a camera in his face after seeing him in public. Donating your hard-earned money to the sole purpose of flashing messages like Julie and Ian Brand and something. Or anything related to Chris's affair with Bob. During his live streams, especially when it has nothing to do with the topics. Telling Chris about his past lives. Giving Chris money to ask for his thoughts on your messed up YouTube videos. Worse still is creating AI videos claiming to be Chris and giving him money so he'll watch them for whatever reason. Impersonating historical figures. Even cringier still, attempting to make AI artwork copying Chris's style and claiming you commissioned him to make it. And finally, worst of all, breaking the law and needlessly risking a life-altering criminal record in pursuit of the lulz. This includes, but is certainly not limited to, vandalizing or trespassing on Chris's property, which includes egging his house, illegally recording telephone conversations, stalking and harassment of him, his mother, and the rest of their extended family, stealing from them, extortion, or threatening them with violence or even outright murder. This also applies to aiding and or encouraging other Weens or Chris himself to do so. We really shouldn't have to say at this point, but guys, don't do any of this. Why should you not be doing any of this? Well, or anything we've... And bear in mind, this is just the things that the wiki has outlined. It doesn't include, everything else. Like, for example, don't think for 1 second trolling attempts that have worked on Chris before, you should apply to other people asides. Like, why? Why do you think it's going to work like that? I don't think, World of T-Shirts is going to believe in the idea or the concept that somebody much better than him is stealing all his thunder. We're not going to have a Liquid T-Shirts saga anytime soon. Because guess what? It's already happened. It's a little bit hard to do that again. Also because it's a bit embarrassing and all that, considering the person we're referencing or turning towards. What weaning is not. As annoying and unhelpful as weaning is, the term has ended up being severely misused by much of the quick sphere. To the point where some consider it to be any form of interest or interaction at any point with Chris or the word relating to him and his misadventures. As such, it's important to keep in mind what actions are not considered the correct definition of the term, which includes, but is not limited to, Casual observation and discussion of Chris and his circumstances, in places such as this very wiki or the Kiwi Farms, where they are permitted and or actually relevant to the topic at hand. Any trolling plan that actually succeeds to some extent, be it good or bad for Chris, original or cringy, etc. Asking basic repetitive Chris questions as a newbie, regardless of it's to do with recent events or those from the classic era. And such, even the most devoted Christorians had to start somewhere. Coming up with speculative Christory based on past and ongoing events. Making fan media, art, fanfiction, animations, cosplay, etc., of the Solitude series, so long as it's not excessively perverse, grotesque, or intentionally poorly made, and you don't go out of your way to show it to Chris. Helping to document and provide information on developments and occurrences in Chris's life as they come. The same goes for any corrections and confirmations, with appropriate evidence of ambiguous and or unconfirmed information. Visiting public locations where Chris is well known to have been or is otherwise associated with, such as the Charlottesville Fashion Square, Gear Hearts, the End Games, or Piedmont, Virginia Community College. Of course, this is so long as you don't try to fail troll or otherwise harass anyone for info on Chris. If you do visit these places, consider doing some good old out of it, as well as by supporting them and the local community through donations, if applicable, and or purchasing from them. I mean, bear in mind the last time that Chris was at PVCC was 20 years ago. Do you guys really think Chris would, anyone who's still working there would know anything at all about Chris? No, I didn't think so. Arguments against trolling attempts. Well, I can think of at least 100 on the top of my head, but let's see what the wiki's got for us. Now, we know what you're thinking. You're not one of those try-hard 13-year-old boys who still think that screaming July or Ian Brand something at Chris, spamming his Twitter or YouTube comment section with pickles and other outdated catchphrases and memes, making and sending him badly made parody comics, or trying to rehash the Liquid Chris saga in the height of its wit. You've come up with a great plan to really get under Chris's skin, bring back the good old days and all of that stuff. However, 99% of the time you should just throw your ideas in the can and all of your trolling plans and move on with your life. Why we may say this? Well, the Chris of today is nothing, and I mean nothing like his former self. Chris has gone a long way since his internet debut on the Something Awful forums. He has gone from a simple-minded man with childlike tendencies that made a bunch of comics which are so bad they're fascinating, to a jaded, chronically depressed, and mentally disturbed hippie that's formed a small doomsday cult around said comics. It is important to note that Chris, although still very gullible and severely detached from reality, which is still somewhat debatable, is still a thinking person. Whatever gets him riled up nowadays ultimately depends on time and situation. Therefore, a lot of the commonly associated triggers he had years ago will not necessarily transfer over to the present day, or not in a way that anybody can predict or hazard a guess as to how Chris would react to them. It should also be noted that, because of this change in perspective, trolling hits differently in this day and age than it did before Chris lost his father, which is incidentally the point where most of Chris's most famous trolls opted to leave him alone. The general culture around Chris Chan himself has changed significantly as well. While past trolls like Clyde Cash and Liquid Chris were praised for a time, and are still fondly remembered and respected by those who don't see them as being as bad as Chris, despite all the evidence, the days of trolling Chris as the heteronormative, egotistical man-child have faded to trolling Chris as a mentally ill, self-destructed, broken shell of a human being. The only people to really succeed in gaining infamy comparable to the trolls of the classic era, such as the Idea Guys and Jacob Sockness, are subsequently derived as the perverted, exploitative abusers that they are, rather than treated as internet legends. The irony in all of this is that most trolling attempts no longer face Chris at all, and those that do somehow succeed are only viewed as further support for his cult. Therefore, you should never expect to be one of the cool kids just by fail trolling Chris. Times have changed, so it's best to move on to better targets. This leads us to this next point, which is there are and always will be much better targets than Chris. Now, if you're willing to put that much effort into trolling Chris, why not make yourself useful and apply that same effort to going after better victims? As much as the Quickie analyzes and discusses in detail his numerous odd behaviors and personality flaws, Chris doesn't even come close to the bottom of the barrel of internet scumbags. Neo-Nazis and other hate groups, social justice warriors, abusive lovers and parents, scam artists, PDFs, EBFs, corrupt politicians and corporations, religious zealots, ZPHs, and other animal abusers, hackers, SPHs, and malware writers, distributors, gang members, terrorists, and their online recruiters, A-logs, enablers, and many other assorted, bad guys are much more deserving of concentrated trolling than Chris will ever be. And to be fair, I think I know at least one that fits into pretty much one person to fit into literally each and all of these categories, even the things that they don't mention. Even those who are just kind of assholes when they can get away with it. Even if you don't care who the troll bait is, as long as it gets you laughs under lucricities, the Chris of today just isn't as amenable to trolling as he used to be. As discussed beforehand, the amount of effort you would need to put into navigating around his paranoia and autistic sensibilities would be staggering to say the least. And even if you do manage to bypass these obstacles, and that's a big if, what is there left to do to him? Anything amusing about him has already been exhausted, except perhaps the stuff that he does on his own initiative, circa Sonic Boom. Also discussed further below, cobwebs. All that is left of him at this point is a withered husk of a lolcow. As much as many of you try to milk it, you'll be hard-pressed to not only get cobwebs, dust, and shriveled dead insects in return. That's also why some people have also attributed Chris to being what's referred to as a horror cow, but at the same time, that was kind of like one incident. Bad though it was, it's not quite. I think somehow Chris has managed to move, and a lot of people have also moved on from it. Although it does sound a little bit silly to say something like that, but everyone's decided to move on from it to some extent. You may as well just spend your time on another lolcow who hasn't been inured to years of deceit and humiliation, no matter how deserving and no matter how fortuitous. For most aspiring trolls, the only reason to pick Chris over any other internet jackass is because he's relatively well known even today, and you have a ready-made audience available to appreciate your efforts. But that's just you being lazy, not some trolling mastermind. Meanwhile, the Chris of today is not quite as gullible as he used to be. Granted, almost no one on Earth is as naive as Chris was in 2007. However, since then, Chris has gradually learned that when he's contacted by people claiming to be Shigeru Miyamoto, Batman, Vanessa Hudgens, etc., 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 someone from his past, or even his own relatives, there's a heavy chance that he's just being trolled. In fact, the naivete of the younger Chris has been swapped for an extremely distrust of anyone who tries to contact him. To that extent, where he's even turned down legitimate attempts to get in touch by people he actually knew at high school or college. This hasn't been helped at all by Weens, according to senior trolls. Chris was once contacted by 10 people claiming to be Megan at the same time, all of them claiming to be the true and honest Megan, and telling him not to believe the others. Chris also vets those who try to bait him with fake social media accounts of people that he follows. Weens tried this during the Dupree saga, only for Chris to embarrass them by thoroughly debunking their claims, complete with evidence. As of today, Chris simply doesn't care about whatever hackneyed, inane scheme you've come up with for him. Even the most persistent attempts at bribery don't seem to affect him as much as they used to. Also, your idea is probably not even original. Whatever your scheme is, it's probably been done before, and most likely by better trolling. It's pretty much impossible to top getting Chris to believe that the president of Nintendo was interested in his work, or that there really was a dang dirty imposter whoever else thought was real, and Chris thought that his identity and fame was being stolen from him. Or convincing Chris to destroy his own life upgrade on camera in an attempt to claim a $9,001 bounty that had never actually existed. Or even simply pull some strings to have Chris's father walk in on him masturbating. By and large, most modern trolling plans tend to be some incredibly minor variation on something that's already been done. For example, what if we got his high school ring? Or, what if we got him to see another parody of his comic? In short, you're wasting your time trying to rehash older trolling events, because we've all seen it before. More importantly, so has Chris, who would very likely figure out what you're getting with it too. Yeah, I think somehow I think Chris has to have accepted at some stage in his life that, yeah, I've seen this before, and well, what exactly happened when I saw this before? It's somewhere along the line. It must have wormed is probably the better way in some way. I don't think Chris like worked it out of his own accord. It sort of just more came back to him in a very vaguish sort of form. Meanwhile, Wienery discourages Chris from producing content. Chris is at his most productive, you see, when he believes he has lots of fans and everyone, barring a few trolls here and there, loves him. Most agree, however, that Wienery is detrimental to the strange symbiotic relationship, and it is considered to be one of the predominant causes of the slump in content between 2011 and 2014. In that time, Chris entered a hiatus as a result of a combination of mourning for his then recently deceased father, understandable, and a constant stream of weenery over the years that made him think of himself as a victim who wouldn't be able to do anything without being harassed. As a result of all this, he became far more private and reclusive, meaning barely any content for the rest of us. And it took several long years for him to re-emerge from this hiatus. However, just because he came back did not mean to say he came back as the sort of person we imagine he would come back as. Meanwhile, it is also worth mentioning that Chris produces much better content when he is left to his own devices. Since his semi-retreat from the public eye after his father's death and before he was jailed for incest, Chris has been prosecuted twice, concocted outlandish conspiracy theories, centered on someone that he hasn't spoken to for years, accidentally set his own house on fire, eventually continued working on the previously unfinished Solitude issue 11, again, and sliced his own tate open with a knife as part of a harebrained scheme to grow his own China. All of this without any impetus from trolls. Likewise, let's not forget that the entire Merrily Woe saga, along with at least 2 different independent blogs of Chris's bizarre mannerisms and behaviors, happened before he would even rose to fame. Don't rush the master of America's favorite game. Plus, if you fail hard enough, you will become a target for trolls yourself. Anthony A. Log Logato is the textbook example of trolling backfiring on the would-be troll. And it's important to remember that he would never have attracted the attention of the internet if he had simply toned down the vitriol enough to make it less obvious that he was absolutely obsessed with Chris. It was thereafter a fairly obvious leap in intuition to assume that someone with that level of hysteria and monomania over someone they had never even met would have had some skeletons in their own closet. Not surprisingly, A-Log had a few more than a few. These included terrible homemade Yif fanfiction featuring a tellingly moderately endowed Fox OC, a huge cachet of disturbing Rule 34, a noticeable portion of which included underage characters, a laughably poor college radio show from which he almost got fired after being caught watching pornography in the studio, and a video where A-Log does an excruciatingly unfunny stand-up comedy bit revolving almost entirely around attacking Chris and what the radio was playing at the time. All before a crowd who, judging by their reaction, had never ever heard of Chris. A more recent example of this is the case of Michael Hurties. After a myriad of sock puppet accounts, spam messages to Chris, and anyone he conversed with numbering in the thousands, mostly consisting of outdated memes and ad hominem attacks, and enough angry rants for him to be described as being truly obsessed with Chris, it naturally led to some digging. Sure enough, and we really do mean sure enough, Hurties was revealed to be an unemployed furry who is somehow even less mature and more prone to rage than Chris, despite being nearly 20 years older than him, and having a number of highly embarrassing things to his name, including, but not limited to, criminal convictions and a newspaper article of him in a fursuit discussing yiffing. Consequently, he became a huge laughingstock overnight, not only turning into a lolcow himself, but it even got to the point where Chris himself dismissed Hurties, and by extension everything he'd done, as an irrelevance. By the same token, obsessive and excessive wienery is dangerous, and it's because, for like, to get noticed by other trolls who will, in turn, hoist you on your own totem pole. In other words, it's akin to plugging in a huge neon sign pointing to trolls straight to your collection of Goku, X, and Frank / fanfiction and boy band shrines. Even successful trolls themselves can become targets to one or two extents. After several months manipulating Chris, the Idea guys had their real-world identities exposed in the first half of 2018. Between October 2017 and March 2020, Kiwi Farms officially encouraged users to dox weens as a deterrent. Several would-be weens have been foiled in this way, and the effects have possibly spread into their real lives. Chris himself has also carelessly exposed those who try to interact with him while remaining anonymous. Remember, this is an energetic community devoted to recording every facet of Chris's life and interactions. You will be noticed, especially if you try to conceal yourself. And as covered in more details down below, the attention you'll end up receiving will likely be of the undesirable kind, even if you do somehow catch Chris's attention. Due to her edgy behavior, A-logging towards Chris, attempts at weaning Chris, and spreading misinformation when faced with being doxed, Bella has been wildly disgraced by the greater Quicksphere as a result of this behavior. And finally, even if you do succeed, you will likely regret it later. Chris Chan he's an enigma, which to so many people, they thought he was a troll, because they're like, there's no way this guy is real, because he's like the saddest human being ever. And it's sad because it's like, I spent 4 years of my life messing with him, and people are like, bring it back. And I'm like, no, let it die. It's like depressing. It's not the golden age, it's the depressing age. This being Spaz Kid on the unwanted attention he receives from weens even to this very day. Also, there's been tons of things in my life I've regretted and hated doing later on. All of that stuff from 10 years ago was one of them. I've moved past everything that happened those many years ago, and obviously I'm a different person now. It wasn't funny, and was a very A-log thing to do. Nothing much else to say. The words of Blue Spike, by the way, reflecting on his time involved in the Julie saga. Well, part of me was about to say about Blue Spike is that, Blue Spike could say that he regretted it all he wants, but he still did it all the same. All too often, trolls that do somehow manage to succeed in extracting lols from Chris end up getting more than they bargained for. For example, Spaz Kid stopped making Sonic 2 the animated series when he began to pity Chris and realized he wasn't worth trolling. On top of a lot of unseen drama involved with the series, writers and voice actors, but still regularly finds himself, as seen above, hounded by obsessive weens and A-logs to keep making it against his wishes. Liquid Chris may have to spend a long time fending off accusations from people outside of the Chris Chan bubble of tormenting an emotionally vulnerable autistic man for his own amusement. However, it doesn't seem as if this is really boiled, or affected his career in any other way. At least, if things were brought against him. Blue Spike will turn 30 someday, and even then will be thought of as the crazed, sadistic pervert who, at the age of 13, willingly listened to a 27-year-old masturbate repeatedly for hours on end, and forced him to shove a broken clay medallion up his ass. Even after he has since considerably matured and openly shown remorse for his previous actions. The idea guys may have to deal with many long-term legal troubles one day for manipulating a mentally handicapped man into abusing himself and extorting frivolities and large sums of money from him, or for a stupid, cruel joke that amused no one but themselves. To add to the irony, people who didn't intentionally upset Chris are still getting unwanted attention from weens. Do you think, for example, Adam Stackhouse enjoys being inundated by various unwanted, "You prevented Chris from blankety Megan, congrats" messages in his email inbox, especially since he openly made peace with Chris in 2018? Or that Mary Lee Walsh appreciates seeing herself as a nubile anime blonde who exists solely to torment a virgin with rage, every time she or her students uses Google. Or that Michael Snyder likes being constantly reminded by weens of being harassed and hit by a car, through misguided attempts to praise him, or being tormented about said events almost a decade later. On the guest book of his own father's funeral? In all of these cases, the answer is no. And even more to the point, there is absolutely nothing left to gain the community surrounding Chris. Not only do you have the active Chris Chan community who are more than willing to come after most wannabes who attempt to do so, but also how the consequences will, in such circumstances, very likely end up spreading into your actual life, as has been seen on numerous occasions. Even without going in with the intention to troll, fan documentaries and information sources, such as this very wiki, already extensively, and we do mean extensively, cover Chris and his entire life. And when new events and such occur, it's far more likely covered by them without you needing to dig in too deeply. And even by the time you dig in too deeply, well, what exactly have you found that hasn't already been discovered and rubbed over to the very last detail? Yeah, surprisingly enough, the end of the Chris Chan story is sadly what we suspect it's going to be. It's going to be a story in which there's no real heroes, no real villains in many cases. It's merely just a tale of misguided human beings with a centralized focus. Sad as it may seem, ladies and gentlemen, but how else can you can't really paraphrase it in any other way than that. But with all that being said and done, I hope all of you guys enjoyed this article about weens, and I will see all of you guys again next time. Thank you. Okay, so you may remember last time, ladies and gentlemen, how I said that weens are probably the most annoying sort of like internet presences that surround the community about Chris. I lied. I think enablers are not only far more detrimental, but I think they're probably in many ways even more toxic. More toxic than probably, and probably even more dangerous than many of us would say otherwise. Why do I say this? Well, let's get to work, shall we? Enablers, or docs, or devotees of Christian solitude, as Chris has termed for them, are those who actively encourage Chris's negative behavior and or self-destructive habits. Enablers can be divided into two main classes. The first being financial enablers, throwing money at Chris, and the second being the fantasy enablers, endorsing Chris's grandiose delusions. They are not necessarily limited to just doing these, however. The overall characteristic that defines all enablers, excuse me, is that they will perform an action with the sole purpose of encouraging Chris to behave and live like a child. Whether it be to encourage him not to be employed, which is a ridiculous thing to say considering everything we know that Chris has been to when, he knows exactly what happens when you're drastically short of money. But what else can we add? Oh, yes. Providing him for the most basic of human needs, and call it what you will, ladies and gentlemen, but there are some things a little bit go without saying that probably are even more basic than we could even put in place here. Role playing with him, and much, much more. Some enablers and white knights do fall into the subcategory referred to as anti-trolls. What does all of this mean, you may be asking yourselves? Well, those who try to ward trolls and Tetrid members all away from Chris to have him for themselves. These are not to be confused, however, with counter trolls, who primarily, but not always, fight actively against trolls in order to protect Chris, rather to troll him themselves through their own antics and wild stupidity. Yeah, I know it should go without saying, ladies and gentlemen, but sometimes trolls are not necessarily the smartest people in the world. I think you could demonstrate this by the time you sort of catch on to their antics. But let's move on, if you will, to what can be described as an enabler and what exactly are their antics for the world at large. Light enablers. Now, light enabling is the least harmful type of enabling one can do against Chris, despite the fact that it is still enabling at the end of the day. As some people who have talked to Chris have also noted, one cannot communicate with Chris without entertaining his fantasies to some extent, and so rely only on this technique, which involves merely acknowledging the beliefs without outright giving him any new law or talking to him extensively about his beliefs. Gatekeepers. Gatekeeping refers to controlling access to Chris. It is used by trolls to prevent white knights and wannabe trolls from interfering, and by white knights to prevent trolls from contacting Chris. The Miscreants troll group, for example, actively interfered with white knights in order to help Chris by deleting their emails before Chris could read them, or by manipulating Chris to believing that the white knights were leaking information. The Watchmen, a white knight enabler group, tried to gatekeep Chris from trolls. In the case of Larry Vaughan, they pointed out Chris shouldn't be interacting with them, though Chris still insisted. In the case of Jacob Sockness, they had Chris record. Chris releases a statement regarding Jacob Sockness to discourage Sockness from completing his trip to see Chris. Fantasy enablers. Chris's grip on what is real and what is being fed to him has never been that robust to begin with, and has eroded even further after years of being deliberately misled. It has washed away to such an extent that he is nearly incapable of distinguishing seemingly even what ideas come from his own head and what come from others. Enablers exploit this, you see, and other facts aside, by presenting Chris with their own invented information about the dimensional merge or Chris's imaginary friends, validating his thoughts and convincing him that he is not alone. A prime example of this is in Jacob Sockness, who used fictional dialogue between various characters between Chris's characters and his own imaginary pantheon. Chris fully believed that this dialogue was legitimate and expressed that he had heard it himself. Collectively, these enabler fabrications are known as the cult of the idea guys, for they had their own root in the idea guys example and have become the basis of Chris's religious beliefs. This pseudo cult's name is meant to poke fun at how Chris has incorporated all of their beliefs and turned it into a religion, where followers worship him as their god. Since the Idea Guy saga showed to everyone by mid 2018 that Chris really was this gullible, the go to method for those trying to influence Chris has been to act as enablers of his delusions, replacing the previous method of posing as sweethearts. Same game, just different roles. Financial enablers. Besides sanctioning his belief in his own divinity, there is another way that enablers have found in winning Chris over, through his wallet. What do they say, ladies and gentlemen? Money talks? Well, they're not wrong. Though his situation is not nearly as dire as during the financial crisis some years ago, Chris remains as irresponsible with money and adamant not to work as always. As a result of all this, it is always precarious at best, providing him with money that he regularly requests, whether through lavishing him with expensive gifts, buying his overpriced shoddy merchandise, or donating monthly for comics that he does not want to make. It is a technique used by enablers who can afford it, such as Sarah and Steve, and even some who cannot, such as Ali Hirschberg, to present themselves as Chris being kindly and selfless, often in combination with worshipping and joining in his role playing. Over the years, Chris has gotten thousands from his audience in the form of donations and considerations. He has received thousands more in sales through storefronts such as eBay and Etsy. As the notice on the homepage suggests, the Quickie strongly advises against giving Chris money, which we will be talking about in much greater detail in the weeks to come. But for those who do want to know this, here is what Chris received in kind: a laptop from Wiener, North Carolina, on August 2011. Details: Chris spoke about it in gratitude for a good person in NC. A common theory is that the laptop had been interfered with a keylogger. Well, infected with a keylogger. But Chris outsmarted the Wien by upgrading the computer. Probably formatted it, stuff like that, so it was like straight out the factory. Next, $500 from the Kiwi Farms, received January of 2014. Why? Donated by fans after the house fire. $150 from fans from September 2014. This is from a Kickstarter campaign in which Chris explicitly stated he would use it to buy Legos. $1,000 from D-Stex from September 2015. Now this was donated during the climax of his review series of Sonichu to fund the production of new pages for the comic. Chris used it, however, to buy a new bed, arguably one of his only sensible purchases in recent memory, but then failed to keep his side of the deal for almost 2 years. One would consider this almost a form of theft, but at the same time, I don't think D-Stex has put in a complaint anytime soon, despite the fact that, well, I'm sure Chris had in writing in some way that he would do it, so you can't really argue against that, I guess. $500. Sonic Rainbow from a Kiwi Farms user from September of 2015. They sent Chris a Visa card with $500, later admitting doing it to get interesting content. And what they found out is that Chris spent pretty much all of it over the period of like 4 months, I think, at McDonald's. I'm going to say actually 2 months, to be honest, because Chris sometimes will just go there twice a day, or whenever he feels like he has to do something aside from nothing and just, I don't know, blinking or grieving. You take your pick. Hundreds, mostly from Weens, during the summer of 2016. This was during the financial crisis, by the way, and a pattern seemed to form by Chris begging for money, then briefly stating that he had received donations before begging for even more money. And yes, the financial crisis is an insane thing to go through, and to be honest, by the time we get to the end of it, hopefully we'll have learned some things about, the true responsibility of money, because Chris certainly doesn't and will continue not to do that. Probably even to this day, but that's maybe a different story. $2,650 from selling the Relics of Fail. This is from August 2016 to probably even this very day, which includes but not limited to the Megatron pistol at $50, the Sonic Totem at $1,500, the Pokey Walker of Fail at $100, and She Came for Quick at $1,000 as part of the slightly damaged set, if we're being frank. $4,816.43 from Patreon. This is from December 2016 to August of 2021. Chris earned pledges from fans and Weens every month. When, if we're being completely honest about it, guys, considering what Chris actually turned out, I think you could comfortably knock 2 zeros off of that, and yeah, you could sort of guess as to what Chris probably did in terms of work. Because I'm not really like $481, debatable over that period of time. $4,816, definitely not. $1,000. This is as a result of selling binders of all Pokemon and UFS cards from January 2018 to 2019. 4 binders of cards were sold. At least one was purchased by a seller hoping to resell the individual cards. Yeah, so they probably at least made a cool profit on this purchase, which I don't know if Chris knew about stuff like that, but he maybe should have, I guess. $100 from selling a stained copy of issue 14 from February 2018, which was pretty much accustomed to selling trash at this point. And by the way, I'll tell you what, we'll cover this in more detail, but what you're going to start noticing round the side here is that, well, they're a little bit outrageous in terms of what was given to Chris and what Chris pretty much didn't do. 1,300, 1,000, 391, 500, 400, 200, 600, 190, and relatively unknown disclosures. Total given to Chris since at least 2014, to my knowledge, $17,806.43. And please bear in mind, guys, this does not include when Chris was doing live streams from 2013 onwards. To be honest, that probably would round this up to about just short of $19,000. Bear in mind, this also doesn't include whatever Chris made from ad revenue on YouTube. If we really wanted to possibly include ad revenue on YouTube, we'll throw in about, maybe, to be generous, another $400. So really, and despite almost, ladies and gentlemen, making as much as some people make in an entire year at a minimum wage job, whether or not Chris really deserved that, it's a good question, because here's the thing. You could best get an idea for the... I'll tell you what, we'll cover more of that when we come to Chris and money. I don't want to, make this a whole thing about Chris's financial cues, but to be honest, yeah, you can sort of hazard a guess what I'm trying to get at. Motives for enabling Chris. There are several motives people have used over the years to justify enabling Chris, which include, but are not limited to profit off of the community surrounding Chris. Now, many of these enablers are opportunistic hacks, well, that's a surprise, who aim to use Chris's platform to launch their career. These people, however, do not have the talent required to make anything worthwhile and bait Chris into talking about them to help launch their career. Into what exactly, I have no idea. A recent enabler, Ben Saint, badly attempted to develop a saga of his own within Christery by copying what Alec Benson Leary did, which was to promote his own media and make money off of fools who would buy that stuff. Now, in order to do this, Chris's delusions, he fed into Chris's delusions and added some of his own characters into the Sonitude comics. It didn't work to my knowledge. Join in the creative community surrounding Chris. Tip: nobody is stopping you from making fan media. If you want to, then by all means, but just try to make sure Chris himself doesn't see it. A bit easier said than done, but whatever. Observers of Chris often include people who enjoy drawing, animation, fanfic writing, cosplay, and the like as a hobby. While many will post their artwork at places strictly for discussing Chris, such as the Kiwi Farms and Reddit, to keep their distance from Chris, enablers approach Chris directly with their fan art on Twitter or Discord, with the intent of seeking his opinion despite knowing well he has issues distinguishing reality from fantasy, and will interpret their artwork as it is happening in reality, quite literally. Over time, these enablers built up a community for sharing their artwork with the side effect of affirming Chris's fantasies. Sad, but that's usually how it happened. Attention whores. Some of these enablers desperately seek attention, and approval from Chris is something they crave for the most. They want attention, and they obviously don't get any at home. So the quickie is the next best alternative to get it. People such as MKR Nightv, Helena Forenza, Jacob Soklas, Sarah and Steve, and Richard Righteous come under this category. They often ardently defend Chris's beliefs after being an all-powerful goddess and getting into lengthy arguments with others over their actions. To make Chris produce content artificially. For most people, it would be utterly despicable to manipulate someone as mentally ill as Chris, let alone so that he can become a means for their enjoyment. For the enablers, however, with more spiteful intents in mind, they would argue that the reason that they are further deluding Chris is strictly because it would encourage him to produce more content. They would tell Chris all kinds of nonsensical stories just so that he can act like their own personal lolcow to laugh at. Almost like some loose pet, if you will. I'm just supporting him / her / them. This argument is most common amongst the more white knight or social justice oriented crowd. Those who take this approach can see Chris as the victim of the alt-right trolls, or whatever villain of the week has been created to oppress them. As such, to them, Chris is a beautiful, unique creature who is to be coddled and praised regardless of the merit of that praise. Often this praise will be sycophantic in nature, with constant praise of Chris's artistic ability and creative genius. Another common narrative is that Chris is a grown adult who is perfectly capable of taking care of himself, easily separating the wheat from the chaff in regards to orbiters. We'll let you decide how competent he is. To protect him from other enablers. Some enablers have already realized that it is impossible to communicate to Chris unless they can entertain his beliefs. So they attempt to assist Chris by, at first, playing into his own fantasies and then subsequently attempting to dismantle these fantasies from the inside or encourage less harmful ones. However, attempts at doing so have mostly failed. Probably because, do you really think it's a fight you want to be involved with? Because who really wins in this argument? Arguments against enabling Chris. Whether you intend to help Chris, make him fall further into his delusions, or attempt to pull a liquid Chris on him by playing along with his delusions, there are a handful of reasons for why enabling Chris is generally not a good idea. 1. Enabling Chris gives him a motive to never change. It goes without saying, but if one's beliefs are confirmed all of the time by the people that surround them, they have very little reason to change the way they are. This kind of helping Chris is what made him so egocentric and puerile in the first place, and that was when it was just his parents enabling him. Even if you do have good intentions and a genuine desire to help Chris, this way of helping is, ironically, one of the most harmful things you can do to him. By reinforcing the delusional state of a mentally ill person, you are doing nothing but unintentionally making their life worse. Now, on one hand, fantasy enablers will play into Chris's desire to relive his childhood. On the other hand, financial enablers will constantly donate him money out of guilt. The actions of both groups combined have made Chris deny any sort of adult responsibilities because it made him believe that he can sit on his ass all day daydreaming, as other people provide his most basic needs. And as you can imagine for yourself, ladies and gentlemen, even when Chris does do things for himself, um, he will sort of go in the direction of that's enough he has to do because it's done enough to gain some level of traction. Not always, but it seems to have. There's a bit of a pattern with these sorts of things. The impact of the idea, guys, has been catastrophic to both Chris's mental state and the Sonichu universe. In recent years, Chris's mental state has deteriorated from fantasy-prone escapism to complete detachment from reality. Chris has become so delusional that he believes he is married to several Sonic recolors and a Pokemon as part of a polyamorous marriage, is a goddess with psychiatric powers, is worshipped by millions as their Lord and Savior, and is even the outright reincarnation of Jesus Christ. By indulging in Chris, that is, encouraging a 43-year-old man to believe he is really a deity and anime character after he was tricked into thinking that in the first place, you are only making things worse, and even helping to perpetuate the idea guy's machinations. When a person has deluded themselves into a belief that is potentially harmful to themselves and others, the best thing to do is not to reinforce said delusion, but rather to get the person professional help. Telling him others agree with his nonsense only causes him to become even further detached from the real world than he already is. Agreeing with Chris, you see, that he is the holy patroness of a computer from the 80s, and that cartoon characters will soon start showing up in the real world, has also, much to the surprise of nobody, proven a disaster, and a prerequisite into interacting with him for any extended period of time. Even if you do not intend to indulge in his fantasies, you cannot interact with him normally to undo any of the damage done by the enablers. The guard dogs, who originally intended to keep Chris from getting manipulated again, also needed to play along by alleging that Chris's amethyst ring was causing psychic chaos to gain their position over him. Most who are willing to play along with Chris in this way or in any other way would justify their actions to third parties by professing they are doing this to help Chris in the end. Unfortunately, in the end, despite their efforts, Chris had refused to cooperate with them any further, and decided to go back to his fantasy world and continue falling for other enablers no matter what they said or did to him. Rarely does interacting with him yourself to tell him about your world clashing with his create the same effect as him getting angry over a minor character design alteration or getting irrationally mad at a non-existent enemy. In the past, some of the best Chris content has come from his own head and actions. Most of the time, you see, he is not even bothered by it anymore, seeing as it is as another happenstance in the world he created for himself. This proves that, by enabling Chris, you are doing the exact opposite of what triggers the best of Chris by giving him what he wants or further confirming him and lulling him into a sense of complacency where he is less likely to produce meaningful and or entertaining content. Chris will always try to get what he wants, whether or not it is good for him. Now, to add salt to an open wound, Chris has previously stated that trolling efforts from people like the TT Squad do not faze him at all, purely because they agreed with his views and were polite to him. Therefore, it would be insane to think that trolling Chris in this fashion would get a laugh out of anyone. Chris also no longer believes in basic scientific principles, especially in the biology department, and already believes himself, and presumably himself alone, to completely understand the difference between what is real and what is fictional. He believes that all diseases are a result of extreme stress, and that by being physically connected to a virus, he can completely obliterate whatever ails him. For example, when Chris got a cold in December of 2019, he believed that the primary reason for this was due to how he was triggered by the redesigns of his Sonichu characters by Project SNT. If Chris gets infected with a disease, he will tell himself that said illness simply arose from his emotions and disturbances from other dimensions, as opposed to, acknowledging that he's ill and taking the appropriate steps to help himself. Yeah, as in the American system when it comes to healthcare, come on leaps and bounds. I'm surprised that when people actually see it in the real world, people don't immediately roll over backwards and quite frankly see healthcare for what it really is. Because but don't take my word for it, guys. Listen, if you're ill, it just means you're stressed, and quite frankly, well, stop being stressed then. This does raise an interesting question, because by that logic, Chris, all you had to do was stop feeling stressed, calm down, got over it, and you would have been absolutely fine. Chris, anything Chris says completely falls apart the second you realize nothing he says ever makes sense. Because that's just the logic Chris follows on, or sort of did follow on. To continuously try and enable him with these beliefs, Chris gets put at a risk of suffering even worse ailments without the proper care or treatment. Thus, when you enable Chris's delusions, you are directly putting his life in danger. The knowledge gap between you and Chris. Since the very beginning, Chris has had difficulties in empathizing with other people, or seeing things through their point of view. This especially holds true today, where he has become absorbed within his fantasy land. Some fantasy enablers, particularly in the artist community, might believe they are not doing any harm by drawing fan art or fan comics that Chris likes. However, these people are fully aware that what they draw is simply fiction. Chris is not. Chris doesn't care about your fan art the way you think he would. He now sees it as evidence he can use it to confirm his beliefs about the universe. Directly giving Chris fan art encourages his retreat from reality, as he then spends time what he calls astral projecting to the dimension he believes the artwork depicts, instead of working on improving his real-world life. There is nothing inherently wrong with creating fan art of Sonichu or Sonichu characters. However, doing things such as creating a persona Twitter account, aggressively pushing your art onto Chris, and RPing as your character does make it highly likely that Chris will, and will continue to do until such time as pass, use the art as an excuse to recede deeper into his fantasy world. Getting sucked into drama surrounding Chris. Yeah, you don't want to get involved in that. Second, we're about to explain why. The time and energy spent on getting sucked into drama, just to see who can influence Chris the most, is one of the classic signs of enabling. Because of how trolling Chris is the one-way ticket to fame for some, and due to the amount of people going by the idea guys' techniques, there has been a constant power struggle between groups of enablers vying for Chris's attention, enablers who have been trying to ward off one another in order to reign supreme. An example is a group with Jacob Sockness and Sarah and Steve, clashing against a group with MKR Nightv and Aqua Diamond 8. Sockness, perceiving MKR Nightv as a barrier to his schemes, embarked on a smear campaign, maligning her to Chris and nearly succeeded. MKR Nightv found herself in the precarious position of both doubling down on her allegiance to Chris's beliefs to keep her in his graces, while trying to convince him that the parts of his beliefs that Sockness planted into his mind were invalid, repressing time and effort going to enabling. As you may have guessed by now, this is a very sad situation to find yourself in. You are fighting endlessly over the same weirdo who does not know or care that people are fighting over him. And you are putting yourself at the risk of becoming massive troll bait yourself by doing it. Moreover, you won't be able to influence Chris forever. Chris's fantasy beliefs being validated just leaves an opening for others to eventually use down the line to manipulate him. An example is how a wave of copycats sprang up in the wake of the ousting of the Idea Guys, with several successful adapting their tactics to circumvent the events of the Guard Dogs in order to protect Chris. A related example is of MKR Nightv, who took a page from the Idea Guys' playbook, pretending to be a CPU goddess to align herself with Chris's beliefs. MKR Nightv claimed the charade was helping Chris. However, by feeding into his delusions, she made it easier for others like Jacob Sockness to tap into Chris's beliefs to manipulate him in another direction. And that's when it's sort of like the curtain drops and people can see, actually, you're trying to do this so that Chris can't see the outside world again. It's there are usually common denominators and stuff like this that go a little bit beyond Chris. You will always be assumed to be acting in bad faith regardless of your motives. Due to how many White Knights and Weens have been using the same technique of playing along with Chris's fantasies, it has become much more difficult for Chris to determine if someone's been messing with him, or if they're genuinely trying to help him. Due to his continued facade of kindness towards other people, he will, of course, always go for believing them first until they betray him. Therefore, enablers are always placed on the same level of people like A-Logs and Weens by Christorians, and are readily assumed to be acting in bad faith no matter what they intend to do with Chris. The confidence built by playing make-believe with Chris has been abused several times, and made people complete laughingstocks of the internet as a result. Sarah and Steve, multidimensional White Knights, and Jacob Sockness would all get their foot in the door by affirming Chris's beliefs. In some instances, pretending to channel fictional characters from other dimensions, and then betray their trust for their own entertainment. Onlookers from Kiwi Farms and the Quickie itself have watched White Knights reveal themselves in fact to be Weens many times before. The Quick community at large treats Weens without mercy, even if you are not like the many traitors in recent history. It is impossible to get through to Chris any longer without deceiving him, and such guile is not looked upon favourably. Others have poised the well before you. You will be assumed to be acting in bad faith if you try to influence Chris for any reason and treat it accordingly. Also, I think I'm gonna have to edit that out. If you fail hard enough, you will be laughed at by the internet. At one point or another, you will be caught in the act. When you're finally caught, you are going to have to spill the beans on your elaborate trolling scheme, if someone else doesn't do it before you can even do that. Someone is likely going to stumble across some really embarrassing information about you when they are trying to track down your motives. Remember, if you enable Chris, you will be assumed to be acting in bad faith, so the last thing you would want to do is show off, especially when others tell you to stop. Most enablers do not appear to be aware of the dire consequences of sharing their brilliant plans on various sites that either target Chris or ones he regularly uses, and they thus become the site's laughingstock of the month, just by skipping this caveat in this plans. An infamous example of this failed trolling plan would be the likes of Sarah and Steve. Sarah first got the attention of Chris by asking for a Rose Chew medallion, which Chris had undoubtedly agreed to after they bribed him with a Nintendo Switch. Sarah then told Chris that she and Steve would move over to Virginia to be his only friends to help him in order to help him out by giving him endless gifts and playing pretend with him as a means of further deluding Chris. This has brought them negative attention from the trolls, even more so when they made a rise up when they tried to get themselves noticed by other prominent enablers to be declared King of the Weens. Never a good idea. A more infamous example, however, would be of Jacob Sockness, an amateur sorcerer from San Francisco, who pretended to be sexually attracted to Chris. When he was discovered by the Farms in 2018, he became one of the site's most popular topics of discussion due to his many absurd obsessions and mannerisms. He too had a lot in common with Chris, being autistic, receiving a monthly tugboat, and believing to possess magical powers. Miss Cherry had also proven himself to be a target of ridicule after he had posted in an inactive thread about him on the Kiwi Farms, just so that he could leak his trolling pan and show it off. The Farms naturally did not approve of this, and were not reluctant to dox him. This was made worse when he decided to double down and continuously talk about how internet famous all of this would make him. So the next time you attempt to troll Chris through enabling, always remember you are at a great risk of being the target of ridicule yourself. Meanwhile, if you are successful enough, it can come off as just plain deprived. Out of the 5 groups represented in the Unholy Quintet, we'll be talking about the final one next time, enablers can arguably be considered some of the worst in many cases. Just like with A-logging and carpetbagging, the biggest reason of all why you should not enable Chris with malicious intents in mind is for the legal liability. For some enablers, enabling Chris is more than just a game to mess with his comics. It can get to the point where they realize they can use his gullibility as a tool to do such things as, well, extort money from him. If this is to show you anything about enabling Chris with the intent of trolling him, it is that if you go far enough with this practice, you will become the villain, rather than the funniest guy in the chat room. Also, money given to Chris will not sustain him. After reading what we just read above, you might realize that role-playing with Chris will not place you on the trolling honor roll anytime soon, yet you might still wish to help him, and consider some kind of monetary contribution instead. This is a really bad idea, because in the first place, up until August of 2021, Chris was adequately housed and fed, even if both leave much to be desired, and his monthly tugboat from the United States government provided him and his mother with necessary financial support enough that he, in fact, used to make more money doing absolutely nothing than the average household worldwide gets for an entire family's labor. He certainly was not destitute. He just made extremely poor decisions with what he actually did have. Chris's relationship with money is extremely unhealthy. While he has got himself into as much of a bind as Bob has, he lacks the forethought to save money for the future and attend to his financial affairs in a responsible way. He often spends his money completely on frivolities and then turns to his fan base in order to foot the bill and pay for any other necessary expenses that he simply can't be bothered to do, because he's already completely squandered all of his money. While concerns for what will become of Chris after his mother passes away are legitimate, even as to how it's going to affect his time in the big house, Chris evidently shows no concern for planning for the future. I think the reason for this is because, well, in some small way, I don't really feel like Chris is under the impression that as long as, his most basic of needs are going to be covered, therefore there's going to be no cause for concern, because why on earth would Chris be concerned? Everything would be sorted for him, because everything has been sorted for him. The only difference in Chris's mind is, well, what exactly Chris could actually do for himself. And any money that you give him now to help secure his future will be frittered away on My Little Pony merchandise or video games. Giving him more money now just teaches him that he is free to live beyond his means without a shred of responsibility, because people like you will be happy to foot the bill. Your money will be wasted in Chris's hands and is best kept out of them, and they should be in your pockets instead. And finally, it's just not worth it. Seriously, don't even bother playing pretend with Chris at this point. At the end of the day, he's a seriously mentally ill individual in his 40s and is in dire need of assistance from professionals, even after coming out of prison. No matter what zany scheme you come up with in an attempt to bring back the good old days, the fact of the matter is that attempting to feed Chris's delusions is a bad idea. Those days have long since passed as Chris progressively deteriorates, as do all of us. Playing into his psychosis to help him invent new ways to humiliate himself and become increasingly deluded about his place in the universe, solely for your entertainment, is not something that should be encouraged at this stage in his life. Likewise, it's repeatedly been established that the vast majority of attempts by trolls to try to trick him into improving himself in the long term end up being futile at best and damaging at worst. At this point, it appears that Chris is the only person that can seriously work at fixing his life. And tragically enough, he seems to be more comfortable living in his own little world than rethinking his life to ensure a stable future. Whatever that is, or how much longer he's got. A bit of a depressing way to end this article, I will admit, ladies and gentlemen. But yes, guys, that's the thing, is that it's not really our responsibility to look after Chris. That's the real truth about this. It isn't gonna work. Give it up. Look after yourselves instead. Especially because we've got one more article about this Unholy quintet, but we'll come to that very, very soon. But in the meantime, I'll see all of you guys again next time. Thank you. Good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen, and I bring all of you back to the sort of elocution slash the articulate side towards like Chris's sort of presence on the internet, because I do quite like having discussions of this sort, because there are ways of conducting business online. Chris is obviously an example of sort of what not to do in every single instance. But with that being said, the sort of community that surrounds Chris is also really it's almost just as interesting as the big cheese himself. And whilst we have discussed things like white knighting and stuff like that, A-logging, however, is a bit of a different topic. But let's get straight to work, shall we? What Saddam did in the Gulf War was small potatoes to what Chris has done. Yeah, I think you could already work out where this is going. An A-log providing a helpful example of A-logging by comparing Chris to a war criminal. He who fights with monsters should look to that he himself does not become a monster. And when you gaze into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Friedrich Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil. A-logging, named after noted Christian critic Anthony A. Logato, is a term used to describe the act of overplaying or exaggerating the negative traits of someone lolzily at irrational levels. This often, but not always, includes expressing disproportionate levels of hatred for someone and or wishing physical harm onto them, usually for perceived crimes that they are guilty of. A-logging also typically involves comparing oneself to someone noticeably for lousy or dysfunctional, and claiming that they're not as incompetent as said lousy person. So you can sort of work out almost immediately that it's probably also not a great look because of everything that will follow onwards. People who are suspected of doing this are often referred to as A-logs or A-loggers, and are considered at the other end of the spectrum from White Knights. Where White Knights try to defend Chris and trolls and help to improve his situation, A-logs hold the belief that Chris is deserving of whatever scorn and harm he is subjected to, and then some. While once fashionable, especially when Chris was a relatively new internet phenomenon, A-logging has become associated with people trying to troll shield themselves, like the original A-log, and therefore is looked down upon by Christorians. The shocking revelations that came to light during the incest saga saw A-logging come back into vogue to some degree, though actively wishing death or physical harm upon Chris is still considered by many to be crossing the line. Yeah, guys, there is such a thing as, going too far. Yeah, we know Chris isn't exactly a redeemable figure in many people's eyes, probably because Chris doesn't really seek redemption to that degree. But like I said, you don't make yourselves become the villains in this sort of story. Because when has that ever worked out for the benefit of anybody? It doesn't. That's the sad reality, is that it just is not a good idea. Etymology. Anthony A. Log Logato, born 8th of May 1985, is a YouTuber and voice actor who, at the heyday of Chris's classic era, gained infamy from making what can charitably be called commentaries on Chris. Wait, that's me. Commentary videos are meant to refute bad points and offer opinions of an opposing view. What A-Log did was make videos where he reacted to Chris, pointed out the obvious, and went on tangents about how Chris is an awful person, and how he, A-Log, is better, who needs to have harm inflicted upon him. However, A-Log's monomania led trolls to wonder what he was trying to hide, leading to them doing a bit of research on him. The result was that A-Log became known as Chris Chan 2.0, because, as it happened, he had many, many faults similar to Chris himself, and could easily be considered worse than Chris, among other things. For example, he is a furry porn connoisseur and has made terrible erotic fanfiction, is doing a laughable college radio show from which he was almost fired for being caught watching porn in the studio, was the subject of a leaked video of him doing a painfully bad stand-up routine, and much, much more. Ultimately, A-Log became subject to trolling himself, and is the inspiration for this very term. At one point, A-Log even received his own wiki called the Logatopedia, which was relatively short-lived and unpopular. He also spawned the phrase, "Hi A-Log," used to mock A-Logs and other internet tough guys. Maybe he'll get an article of his own one of these days, but I feel like, yeah, that's, you see, that also comes from just trying to interact with Chris far too close. At least, back in the heyday and all that, when people didn't really know exactly the sort of things that would happen if you weren't careful. Types of A-logs. There are a few types of A-logs, and many of their behaviors can be seen in original A-log commentaries. Troll shielders. Oftentimes, people who A-log Chris do so to troll shield, that is, to avoid becoming subject to trolling themselves. Like A-log himself, they tend to have many traits in common with Chris. They generally have an autism spectrum disorder, still live with their parents well into adulthood, which is somewhat more justified now due to the instability of the housing market in the United States compared to when Chris graduated, are unemployed and or are living off the welfare system, and are sexually frustrated virgins having trouble socializing and forming relationships, and also have this issue with being fixated on cartoons, toys, and other things that most people their age would have little interest in beyond their nostalgic value, outside of those who work alongside such things for a profession, on the internet, in studio, or otherwise professional. Some perhaps have even more faults than Chris, especially bizarre fetishes, as seen in the case of A-Log himself. However, A-Logs will argue that at least they are not like Chris, and are fervent in their vitriolic condemnations of Chris so that people don't troll them instead. More often than not, as in the case of the original A-Log, this backfires and they find themselves becoming the subject of trolling. Anti-devotees. Anti-devotees are those who view Chris or other locals as a sort of anti-role model, serving as a kind of guide on how one should not live their life. As the saying goes, it's good to learn from the mistakes of others, so trying to avoid doing what locals do appears to be a good idea in practice. However, this only works in moderation, and requires some degree of humility to pull off properly. Otherwise, it snowballs into exaggerating his bad traits, and the person becomes a flavor of warrior. Intimidators. Intimidators are those that people usually associate with the term A-logging. Those that wish harm on Chris or believe that he deserves the worst. While Chris is definitely not a good person and has done some horrible things, including cursing his ex-friend for trolling him, which of course she didn't, hitting a game store over with his car, making an innocent GameStop assistant manager, and having sex with his own mother, it is still somewhat ironic that A-Logs think that the best recourse is to wish him death and curse him back. Not to mention, they tend to ignore the many factors that led Chris to behave in this way. Unsurprisingly, unbridled malevolence is never one of them, as discussed in further detail down below. Some would argue, however, that it is sinister and just plain wrong to mock a mentally deficient person such as Chris. A-Logs, however, therefore, try to justify trolling him by arguing that, regardless of his autism and other diagnosed problems, he has shown that he is a bad person who deserves to be trolled. Some A-Logs are themselves autistic, or at least claim to be so, and they can often be heard making arguments along the lines of Chris giving autistics a bad name. Others will appeal to his many instances of bigotry, most of them debatable, as reasons to troll Chris. By establishing that Chris is a bad person, it seems to justify that Chris not only deserves the treatment he currently receives, but also deserves physical and or psychological harm inflicted on him. However, as I've said before, do you think that's a good look, ladies and gentlemen? No, not really. Warriors. Another type of A-Logs are warriors. These promote the idea that bashing Chris is somehow to the benefit for marginalized groups that Chris is a part of, most notably autistic and transgender people. The argument behind this is, in an A-Logger's eyes, it is that it needs to be pointed out that Chris does not provide an accurate representation of these kinds of people and their communities, and that as such he needs to be ostracized. Of course, doing so is to little benefit of the groups that are actively being oppressed, and instead comes across as a relatively flimsy excuse to aim at low-hanging fruit rather than to do something genuinely worthwhile to helping those kinds of communities. It should go without saying that making fun of or directly harassing a mentally ill weirdo on the internet is not going to help anyone's cause short or long term. Arguments against A-logging. Now, you may argue. Now, one thing you're going to notice, ladies and gentlemen, is that they'll go to arguments against. They will. I don't think there'll be arguments for A-logging anytime soon. But with that being said, while Chris is, to put it very mildly, far from perfect, it is generally accepted that calling for him to be harmed or abused like A-logs do merely legitimizes Chris's sense of victimization, and makes the A-logs themselves look sociopathic and unbalanced. For example, Chris is not a Hitler-level monster. We really shouldn't need to point that out, but while Chris is guilty of actions that could be considered foolish, immoral, or downright irreprehensible, being compared to people like Adolf Hitler or Saddam Hussein is at best hyperbolic, and at worst utterly insane. Hitler was responsible for the death of nearly 11 million civilians during the Second World War. Saddam Hussein actively persecuted and murdered almost 200,000 Kurdistan peoples and Shiite Muslims. Or is it pronounced Shiite or something like that? It's a sadly unfortunate way to spell it, but you get the idea. They're not very nice people. Chris's antics, depraved as some of them have been, hardly compare to the atrocities committed by two feared and reviled dictators. For much of his life, he was just a gullible idiot who spent his time trying to hit on women very badly and make them his sweethearts, cross-dressing and playing video games. The revelations relating to the incest saga caused many A-logs, both past and present, to crow that they had been right about Chris all along, and that anyone who had defended or tried to aid Chris to any degree during the past decade and a half was guilty of white knighting him and enabling his actions. While we won't argue that Chris's actions towards his infirm mother are totally indefensible, it should be noted that Chris's prior criminal activities largely consisted of things such as public disorder, traffic violations, trespassing, and petty assault. Not great, but not the sorts of things you want to start raving about anytime soon. Arguably, the worst thing that he had previously done was the hit on run on Michael Snyder. And even then, the court appeared to view Bob as the primary guilty party in the whole affair, judging by her getting the heaviest sentence of the two. It's no exaggeration to say that there's a massive. Well, the reason why is because Bob actually assaulted a police officer during the scuffle. It's no exaggeration to say that there's a massive leap in severity between any of Chris's prior crimes and what he is currently accused of. And while many historians may have been naive as to the extent of his depravity, A-logs can hardly use actions no one could have reasonably foreseen as justification for their behavior. There's also no legal defense over attacking Chris in real life. We really should not have to tell you that inflicting or threatening to inflict harm upon Chris is nothing short of illegal. Perhaps the best reason against A-logging is the legal liability, i.e. being charged with and possibly convicted for stalking, terroristic threats, and or a myriad of other possible charges. Whatever feelings you may have against Chris, there is no legal defense for taking the law into your own hands, and chances are you will end up with a life-changing felony conviction. In addition to this, part of the charm of watching Chris is in his eternal rage over a non-existent enemy. Committing actual violence would only legitimizes Chris's severe victim complex, and likewise would, in such a circumstance, make you the villain. Like A-log, you can make yourself a target if you try way too hard. Chris does not share traits with a lot of people, and some of these traits are quite disturbing and embarrassing. It's a fair assumption, therefore, that a lot of people who follow Chris's antics are unemployed losers on the internet. For example, a lot of people have seen Chris and uttered in their minds, "Finally, here's someone more pathetic than I am." But make no mistake, that is a very low bar to clear. If you extensively go into how much you hate Chris and try to insert yourself into his shenanigans, the same people that you're attempting to impress will likely consider looking into your own shortcomings. As much as Chris is far from being likable, responding to his every move with unconditional hatred can make you come off as being just as much of a target, if not more so, than him. Saying that you are better than Chris is not at all impressive, especially when you take into consideration just how much Chris fails at everything he ever did. Therefore, you should not be using someone else's character flaws in order to justify and excuse your own. That is especially true if that very same person has no bearing on your life as a whole, and are only comparing yourself to a relatively well-known lolcow to feel a less shitty by comparison. Before you fall into the fallacy of believing that voraciously condemning Chris will save you from this fate, remember that having embarrassing traits like Chris doesn't automatically make you the subject of the sort of trolling that Chris has had. It may make you subject to ridicule, but what's more important is how you respond to the ridicule. You could be like Chris and get blangry at every traitorous troll under Lucrisites and give the trolls power over you just like Chris did, or you could laugh with them at your own faults or even just ignore them and go about your day-to-day business. Trolls generally aren't interested in people that can't coax a reaction out of it. All in all, if you don't want to end up like him, A-logging isn't really the way to do it, but avoiding the myriad of mistakes Chris and A-log made is. Being better than Chris is not and has never been an achievement. As mentioned earlier, the incest allegations and accompanying embezzlement of approximately $750 from Bob are now considered by many the point where Chris crossed the line from being a buffoonish, sometimes morally questionable, but mostly harmless individual to someone truly detestable and indefensible. By that same logic, however, trying to aggrandize oneself by A-logging Chris is even more of a waste of time than it was previously, to the point where it will have exactly the opposite effect. Trying to make yourself look better by comparing yourself to a fat, anger-prone man-child with incontinence issues and elementary school-level drawing skills well into adulthood is the kind of juxtaposition that always rung hollow at best. But saying you're better than an incestuous sex criminal with a nose-diving grip on reality and close to 4 decades worth of unsavory information to his name is something so pathetic it can only make anyone attempting it look laughably insecure. And as I said before, there isn't really much else apart from comments down below which have been added to the A-logging wall of shame. And I will say, for what they're worth, if you want to go through any of these, I think it's fair to say just skimming through these, you can tell what the crack is. And for those who can't, I will leave up to your imagination because, quite frankly, quite a lot of them are violent. Meanwhile, there is at least a few more articles to take a look into, ladies and gentlemen, for the likes of Weens, Enablers, and Carpetbaggers. The distinctive note, I will say, just to round up this article when it comes to A-loggers, ladies and gentlemen, is that, like I said before, the interesting parallels when it comes to parasociability, especially on the internet, is to understand that, you know what, if you want to become well-known, famous, infamous, then you have got to get your own stuff out there. Because guess what? Uttering trollish, dare I say even violent comments on the internet is not new, it's not original, and guess what? Anybody could do it. If you want to stand out, then I suggest you do something that actually makes you stand out. For better or worse, ladies and gentlemen, I can't tell people what they can and can't do. What I can say, however, is that sometimes in life there is no such thing as good or bad. There are only consequences. And for good or bad, ladies and gentlemen, you pay the consequences for the choices you make. Not anyone else's, but what you make. And I think with all that sewn up, it is time to say farewell once again. So, bye-bye. I'll see you guys again next time. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and sorry about that. We come to sort of a little bit of the end of the road when it comes to like the mini articles regarding Chris and the internet. The only one we read of like the Unholy Quintet. It should really be the Holy Sextet, however, because trolls do sort of fit under this category, in my opinion, but that's probably going to be a subject for another video. In the meantime, carpetbaggers. What is a carpetbagger, you may be asking? Well, let us demonstrate. A carpetbagger are people who exploit Chris's own infamy for personal gain, typically for money. Trolls of years past sometimes acted this out in order to rile up Chris, such as Liquid Chris, Jimmy Hill, and Jeff Uzo, though this was all part of their act, and no attempts at making a business out of it actually occurred. Several Chris orbiters in the late 2010s and 2020s have actually done so for business purposes. In a few cases, carpetbaggers have sought Chris to collaborate with him, mostly because they know having an eccentric character like Chris is always going to generate a little bit of action, so to speak. So he is the armless, legless wonder of the 21st century. But what are the types of carpetbaggers? Because financial exploiters are just the ones who profit off Chris for monetary purposes, but there are others asides that, well, whilst they may benefit one way financially, it's not the primary motivator. Clout chasers. Clout chasers are people who exploit Chris's infamy for personal gain, usually by creating, propagating, or being actively involved in drama, in order to receive attention to promote their platform. In many cases, this involves creating rumors or actively involving themselves in Chris's life when being associated with him causes an outrage. Now, as you may have suspected, how successful this is in the long term is, well, it's obvious long term this just doesn't really work, because most people either move on or people suss out their intentions almost instantaneously. You kind of have to be a little bit slew sometimes when you go about and actively get yourself involved in Chris's drama. Not that you ever should. Like I said, you observe it in the same way that, like in a zoo, you are on the other side of the cage and Chris is inside the cage. And there are signs saying do not feed the animals in huge letters all around you. So you can't say it's same principle. So you can't say you haven't been told. Examples. Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas is a YouTuber who formerly covered Chris. On the 2nd of February 2020, he began selling a Sonichu and Roastew Valentine's Day shirt on Teespring, featuring art that his girlfriend Taylor had drawn of Sonichu and Roastew. When Dylan promoted his shirt on Twitter, Chris replied expressing interest in one of them. In the wake of the affair with his own mother, Chris was arrested at Regency in Richmond while still wearing the shirt. Dylan decided to further capitalize on this by relisting the shirt on Redbubble with the title The Chris Chan Arrest Shirt, which it certainly sticks to it, and whilst again this is the sort of thing that really didn't last much longer because Dylan retired about 2 years later to my knowledge. So yeah, like I said, it's one of those things where it's not really sustainable. But there are other asides, which include, sadly, Gino Samuel. Now, whilst a lot of people argue one way or the other, Gino has sort of profited from this. But at the same time, it's kind of one of those occasions where you have to think, well, if Gino wasn't going to prophesize from this, then, well, does it make sense sometimes for people to get paid for their work? But it's sort of, we go into a bit of a grey area, and you'll sort of see why. In 2018, Gino Samuel began producing Chris Chan A Comprehensive History, a video series on YouTube. When Gino submitted his YouTube channel for monetization review, YouTube instead terminated his account over the clips of bullying within the series. Gino then set up another channel to continue the series proper. Although Gino did claim in 2023, when advertising other video projects, that he would be preparing for a post-Quick timeline, he instead doubled down. Later that year, Gino began selling items based on Chris's infamy without his approval. These included, but not limited to, knockoff Sonichu medallions and a shirt with "Want Woman" printed on it, a reference to Chris's infamous outfit at Fridays After 5. Gino did not compensate Chris over using his Sonichu character. Though maybe the "Want Woman" is kind of, "Want Woman," you can probably get away with that. considering that, you know, Sonichu, it's in a purely legal sense, like, Gino can do it. It's just, well, if why couldn't have Gino have done so like a different design, something that expresses like certainly who he is? Because Gino was an exact. I couldn't imagine Gino was in a position where he desperately needed to do it, but well, then brings the question: well, why would he do it? Now, whilst that's a little bit of a grey area in my opinion, what's a little unclear, however, is the next bit. In response to seeing the items, Chris posted a tweet criticizing the medallions, and he also posted a YouTube comment requesting Gino cease selling the shirt. Well, whether or not did Gino actually, you know, stop, relinquish, and capitulate? Be interesting to find out. I mean, it's not exact. I mean, to be fair, it's not exactly as if Chris, whilst the comprehensive history series was going out, Chris did leave comments saying what was going to happen next, which were completely untrue. I can't. Gino doesn't really strike me as the sort of person who will almost immediately bend over to peer pressure just because Chris told him to, because that would be being very economical with the truth. Something that the comprehensive history pretty much exclusively avoids. Not perfectly, some things slightly get through the cracks, and well, those have sort of been more made clear with the benefit of hindsight. However, in April of 2025, Gino began uploading his version of a Sonichu the Animated series onto YouTube, which used artwork taken from Chris's comics and was monetized through Gino's Patreon. In response to this, Chris filed a copyright claim to YouTube over the intro and 2 episodes so far, which used Sonichu Issue 0. YouTube then took down the videos and placed a copyright strike on Gino's channel. Seems a little bit overkill, but at the same time, that's kind of if Gino probably thought this was a case worth fighting for, he probably should have done it. But oh well, that's kind of how it is. Kenneth Engelhardt. In 2022, Kenneth Engelhardt wanted to collaborate with Chris on a Sonichu-themed business project during the jail saga. Kenneth envisioned it as an extended universe of Sonichu. Upon learning of Chris's scheme to try to pay off Barbara Chandler to move out of 14 Branch Lane Court, among other disturbing comments, a disgusted Kenneth wrote Chris to inform him that he was planning to kick Chris out of the project. Kenneth told Chris that the project would be run by himself, Helena Florenza, and Eels and the Eggman, by their agreement, and that Sonichu and Rosechu would be broken down and recreated from scratch. Chris ignored Kenneth and stopped responding to his letters. Kenneth has apparently since abandoned his plans. Yeah, that does seem like Kenneth was trying to like strong arm Chris in some way. In fact, to be honest, you know, screw it. Now is a good time for this rant. It may seem as though this is just a bunch of mini cows, you know, sucking at the teats of one major lol cow, but this does raise a very interesting question. Certainly one that I'll have to pose during a maybe a slightly different video, but let's cover some of it now whilst we do have this time. It may seem as though we're arguing one way or the other about people trying to LARP off Chris, and whilst there is, to be honest, not much in my eyes I could see profiteering from Chris, because insofar as I'm concerned, Chris is just a guy who wrote a really poor comic and the internet reacted to him and Chris reacted back, and nearly 20 years in the making, Chris still has not learned anything from all of this and just continues to make the same mistakes exactly as before. A lack of originality, yes, but this does raise the interesting question is that, well, the best way to put it is that a gigantic pile of shit does attract flies. And that's kind of the most apt way to think about this, is that why, and I covered all this before about why you shouldn't be interacting with Chris, because why you shouldn't be touching the poop, because flies go near poop and shit. So why do you really want to be seen like that? Because what exactly are you going to be getting out of a giant blob of shit anyway? I know it sounds like this metaphor is getting extremely messy and extremely long-winded, but this does raise the all-important question. if we know this, and I reckon there are lots of people out there who also know fine well the how bad it may look when you see things in this light, why do people still try to continue to do this? It might be literally because monetary gain. But at the same time, and to give Chris his due, Chris at least sort of had the confidence to get the comic out there in the first place. Infamous though it is, but you can't spell infamous without famous. And whilst I don't really want to give Chris too much of the benefit of the doubt for obvious reasons, what if for someone as infamous as Chris, and believe you me, like we could be barely scratching the surface with just the things we know of. There's still a fascination with it, and people still want to be involved in it. And whilst that's obviously attracts the interest of things like the idea guys, and no doubt they're going to be talked about sooner or later. Well, what can I say? They see him as a cash cow, and the whole at the teats argument continues. Unlike this reconstruction of Solitude and Rose Stew, because by Kenneth's admission, it seems to have gone nowhere, and he served orders to quit. Moving on. Luke. In 2020, Luke mailed a large box of random items to Chris, which included things with relevance to Chris, like video games. Luke paid Chris to autograph each of them. On the 8th of October, Chris drove to Pennsylvania and dropped off the package at Luke's house. Luke then listed the items on Mercury as the storefront quick store, but deceptively claimed that the items had belonged to Chris or his family members. A fairly devious route, don't get me wrong, but yeah, that's actually pretty sly, that is, all things considered. No. Noah has had multiple conflicts of interest between his communications with Chris and his ownership of the Quickie forums and the Kiwi forums gossip communities. You've got that right. In May of 2013, after the 2013 Facebook leak, Noah emailed Chris to both inform him of the leak and attempt to manipulate him into registering an account on Quickie forums. From 2018 to 2021, Noah sporadically acted as a manager of Chris, despite Noah being aware of the conflict of interest between that role and his ownership of Kiwi Farms. He took actions which used Chris's infamy to drive engagement on the forum. These included creating threads to post some of his DMs with Chris, and to discuss the Create Unknowns interview, which Noah had advised Chris to accept. This culminated in Noah asking Chris about using his likeness in the Kiwi Farms silver coins, meant to raise money for the forum. While Noah claimed he would compensate Chris, he later chose to block Chris over an unrelated matter. I'm presuming this is because of, well, the revelations about the affair with his mother. That I can understand, but then I would have literally pulled out about the silver coin matter altogether. It's not a good look. And it is unclear whether Noah followed through with compensation. It's but then again, if it was never legally, if it was never in writing, or if there was any attempts at solidifying business relations, I'm sure that, well, that might have been that. Some may argue that creating business relations, even through messaging each other via WhatsApp, in the loosest way possible, does count. But considering that, as far as we're aware of, Noah was certainly not indebted to Chris, then the argument would have been seen as mutual at the very most, and certainly not business related, even at its worst. Which, you know what, in a legal court case, that's exactly what they would do, and sadly, it's just sort of how it is. I wish sometimes it's the law can sometimes be like that, but what I want again people to emphasize is this, because it's been a very long weekend, and a lot of it is also having to explain to a lot of people just sort of how the law works. And the way I want to phrase it is that the law is not extraditable. Moreover, the law isn't whatever you choose to make it. The law and the rules have to be consistent and the same with everybody involved. Nobody is above or below the law. Everybody has to be at the exact same playing field. I mean, just for example, I'll keep this short, but one of the reasons why during the pandemic, doctors could actually refuse to take the vaccine if they chose. The argument for this is that um, if doctors or those who worked with science or medicine, whatever it may be, if they had no choice, doctors they could contact the union and they could turn around and say, "Hey, look, why does everybody else get a choice but we don't?" It's purely from a legal standpoint is why doctors, nurses, scientists can refuse a vaccine if they choose. With that being said, it does kind of it's a little bit of a slap in the face for what they for in their line of work. But and I certainly haven't heard any cases of myself of scientists and whatnot refusing the vaccine. That whilst a global pandemic was going on, that was taking thousands of lives a day. But what can I say? You know what? That's just sort of how it is. The law has to be consistent with these sorts of things, and that's just kind of why it is. So whilst it's certainly a lot more things down here are looked down upon, legally, most, if not all of these people are sort of, well, technically in the clear. Because probably as far as a lot of these people are concerned, as long as it's not illegal, that's just fine by them. Prater. In September of 2020, a group led by Caden Peck, named Prater, met with Chris and arranged a business partnership with him. Prater's first item up for sale on the group's shop official Quickmart was a Sonichu-style medallion. The medallions were produced by Prater, who paid Chris a royalty for the usage of his Sonichu character. You see, the issue with this one is that it should have been the likes of Chris actually going to Prater. It sounds as if Prater has done this and like formally set up an agreement, and it's the equivalent of like signing of doing a document and literally fraudulently signing the signature in somebody else's name. Whilst of course legally it's not like that at all, but it is a bit devious that they've just decided we'll pay Chris a royalty. Because regardless, you have to set up like a communique somehow, and we don't even know whether or not they even asked for Chris's permission. But that's besides the point, or maybe it's entirely the point. Official Quick Mart later expanded to other offerings, some produced by Prater and some by Chris. Also, we don't even know what these royalties were. Was it what, 25%, 50%? You tell me. Because I don't think they seem to list here for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it was completely undisclosed. In mid-2023, Caden was involved with financing the Big Island, Virginia house, the house that Chris currently lives in and pays rent. Chris and Prater's partnership remains active as of 2025. And I think it's continuing into 2026, although whether that is true or not is an interesting point. I haven't heard anything in terms of like partnership like breaking down, but clearly from what I've seen of Chris's activity throughout February, maybe business is not quite booming, and maybe the Sonichu bubble is starting to burst again. Project SNT. In 2018 and 2019, Project SNT exploited Chris's infamy by promoting projects on redesigning Chris's characters through Patreon. True, but like I said again, the way Chris Chris did overreact to all this, and all Project SNT did is that, like, maybe Project SNT didn't really have the idea in mind, and it was someone that decided they want to pledge and they just did it. And I mean, to be fair, that's just kind of how it is. But then again, if we want to talk about Patreon, what about all the times that Chris adamantly refused to submit paid, obligated pages of Sonichu to his willing patrons who were forking over money hand over fist for seemingly nothing. So yes, I know why it's here, but I think it's a little bit disingenuous when we know how Chris behaved regarding his time on Patreon. So it's a little bit of a. What do you guys reckon? Is it a bit devious to list it here, or are we? Should we give SNT the benefit of the doubt? Rex Rowan Nabors III. In January of 2012, Rex's band released Trollster's Paradise, a true and honest tribute to Christian and the Hedgehog Boys, which covered Christian and the Hedgehog Boys. Despite using Chris's music and audio clips from him, Rex did not attempt to seek Chris's permission and did not compensate him. I mean, how exactly they could have done that, I have no idea. Sonichu Solutions. At the June 2024 Fan Expo in Dallas, a booth named Sonichu Solutions was set up. According to a customer, the owners of the booth were not affiliated with Chris. The owners copied Chris's Sonichu design and offered knockoffs of his medallions. Further, they also sold printed out copies of Chris's JLOB for $15 a piece. We have absolutely no idea what they did, well, how well they did, but $15, that's like, no, I don't even spend $15 a day nowadays and stuff like that, unless I absolutely have to, fuel and everything else. Winfield. Dylan James Winfield, also known as Winfield, born 21st of April 1992 and sadly passed away on the 7th of December 2025, was a self-published horror novel author, intending his debut novel Cult of the Eclipse to be his first in a series. Dylan seemed to have found promoting his book by spamming Reddit and Twitter ineffective. So in June 2021, he hit upon the idea of requesting Chris to do a video review of his book. Although Chris agreed, the review did not come to pass, particularly due to the subsequent incest revelations and jail saga. Undeterred, on the 6th of September 2021, Dylan travelled to Ruckersville, where he trespassed at the yard of 14 Branch Lane Court while taking photos and recording video of its neglected state. During his video commentary, he advertised his book. The following day, he uploaded the video and messaged Gibby on Twitter. This had resulted in his exposure and doxing on the Kiwi farms, and several people calling him out on his clout-chasing attempts, after which he deleted his video within an hour, suggesting he was following the thread. Why then he didn't know better is a mystery. However, Winfield passed away on the 7th of December 2025 due to complications stemming from his diabetes. Yeah, so spamming Reddit and Twitter turned out to be really ineffective. Not exactly goth merengue. I have no idea what Cult of the Eclipse is. I know he tried to publish get some books, some coverage, but well, that's sadly how it is. He tried to chase clout and all of a sudden, well, diabetes caught up with him instead. Speaking of clout chasers. These aren't necessarily people who have fully exploited Chris through monetary gain. It might have been a bit of a secondary point of reference, but at the same time, it's not really what they were after. So let's go. Ben Saint. Known for exploiting Chris's belief in alternative dimensions by using his OC Nightstar and creating comics featuring her to create a slime saga. By September 2019, Ben had uploaded to his Patreon scans of his comic. The Patreon account was used for Ben's projects in general. His non-quick content was behind a paywall, whereas his Nightstar comics were free to view. Brian Frog Boy. In February of 2018, Brian announced a Redbubble shop selling items with art based on Chris Chan, a prequel comic, and also Chris's own art. Chris tweeted in approval. Yeah, like I said, that's just what someone has done off their own back. It's not exactly as if it did spectacularly well, and well, there was plenty of people who went to it anyway. Doopy Doover. Doopy Doover was a voice actress who had gained Chris's attention. Instead of just ignoring him, she decided to profit off of Chris's infamy by going onto Kiwi Farms, creating a personal army against Chris. Now, again, let's just be honest with this. As far as we were concerned, Chris took the whole just a customer and stuff like that way too far, and Doopy was just trying to stay civil in the middle of all of this. And again, it's really just sort of one of those things that I don't think Doopy like benefited like that much, because as far as we're concerned, you may as well say Lady of the Cosmo technically should be added here as well. Then by that logic, that seems a little unfair, but considering that Chris acted like a creep pretty much throughout there and got far too parasocial, the onus would technically be on Chris and not the other way around. Doopy, for example, was not producing stuff immediately to clout on Chris. The only other exceptions is that, well, it's maybe the point is to prove that Chris had not changed whatsoever and hadn't learned the idea of boundaries and learning to understand people may take things the wrong way when you put it in a certain way. But yeah, like I said before, by that logic, Lady of the Cosmos should be here as well. But there you are. I think the only reason why she isn't, the more I think about it, is probably because she wasn't really doing it for the only thing she really did wrong, I suppose, is maybe it's a little bit of an overreaction, but at the same time, this it was something that it was problems that Chris started because, well, Lady of the Cosmo was already a member of Planet Dolan and stuff like that. Anyway, moving on. Edmund Macmillan. Edmund Macmillan, a game developer behind titles such as Super Meat Boy, The Binding of Isaac, Tapeworm, and Mugenics, sought to collaborate with Chris and include his artwork with Isaac and Mugenics. Yeah, I've heard about that, but it's not. Do you really think Macmillan really needed Chris's likeness, or to say, "Look, everybody, Chris Chan's here," for his work to continue? Well, I don't know. Maybe he did. Maybe he was on hard times. But I heard Mugenics got quite a good reception, so why, I don't know. I wish I knew, but sadly I don't. Ethan Ralph. After the fallout of the incest revelations, Ethan Ralph jumped on the opportunity to exploit Chris for views. Ethan, who had a history of vitriolic feelings towards Noel, the owner of the Kiwi Farms, sought to interview Chris, in particular about Noel. When Chris was located at Regency in Richmond, Ethan livestreamed himself driving to the motel in search of him, knocking on every door of the second floor and ordering pizza in a failed attempt to lure Chris out. After being kicked out from the motel premises for loitering, Ethan soon returned upon being notified that the police were in the area and filmed Chris's arrest, all the while screaming comments and questions at Chris. It should be noted that Ethan goes the extra mile by attempting to sell t-shirts with Chris's likeness on it on his online store, without the latter's knowledge or permission, with no plans to compensate Chris for any of the sales made. I don't watch Ethan Ralph, and to be honest, it's through stuff like this. I think it's pretty obvious why people wouldn't do it anyway. There must be something I'm missing, but to be honest, if I missed out on it, I wouldn't even feel bad one way or the other, so there is that. Keffels. After getting involved in a large-scale drama with the Kiwi Farms, had decided to interact with Chris by being in an interview with him. She had also created a Patreon tier with a Christory tax, offering to release the unedited interview for $100,000. It is unknown, and it's probably never going to be made, so we can take that as it is. MKR Night v Nort and Spooky Bones, which I think, well, to be fair, these get like much larger articles on their own, so they'll have to wait for another day. As far as I'm concerned, they mostly just sort of like hung on to Chris in the vain attempt of like trying to defend his actions and saying, you know what, Chris is, it's a little bit overblown, but at the same time, the reactions to him have been a little bit overblown. Nort, however, I'm not 100% convinced about, so that'll probably be another time. Spooky Bones. Hurtful truth levels, will definitely not be served by disrespecting me by ignoring me like I'm a nobody. I'm not a nobody. Spooky after Quickie Jerkop was concerned about Hurtful's well-being. Spooky Bones, also known by her persona Regina George, led the investigations of Isabella Loretta Janke and created the OP of the original Kiwi Farms mega-thread on her. However, as the drama was starting to ignite, and much of Bella's personal life was being dug into by the Mean Girls, the group that Spooky led, Bella left the internet. Spooky, primarily motivated by the attention and recognition she received from the mega thread, then went after other Chris orbiters with even the loosest connections to Bella. I mean, some may argue that, well, trying to do it means that, and the only reason I can probably suspect as to why that happened is because they probably needed evidence, because some things that people found out about Bella, there probably should have been some formal investigation by the state of Texas or stuff like that, because, well, but then again, I'm not too sure if it's really Spooky's place to go on a crusade with on stuff like that. Now, don't get me wrong, Bella is a piece of shit, and I don't feel bad for her whatsoever. However, I'm not the police. I'm not the law, and you don't take the law into your own hands and go on a crusade. is what I'm trying to say. The WCT, which is also going to get its own article because, well, they stuck around as with the likes of Caden and Bella, but Zella. Zeller is a ween who tried to uncover many different aspects of modern Christery, such as Flutter's identity and role, as well as Prater's current work. In the process, he stirred up drama by creating a rumour that Chris and Flutter were going to have a baby. So if you want to know where that rumour began last year, there's your answer. Arguments against carpetbagging. Like the rest of the Unholy Quintet, there are plenty of good reasons to not become a carpetbagger. Associating yourself with Chris is never a good idea. Been there, done that. However, Chris has an infamous reputation, cultivated through years of bad behaviour both online and offline. Most notably, he committed a sex crime by engaging in incest with his own mother. Even though the charges were dropped by the state of Virginia, the knowledge of Chris's actions will never fade from public consciousness. If you connect yourself to Chris, that will be the first thing many people think of whenever they hear your name. Having your name attached to Christery is a terrible idea by itself, but to do so on a large scale that millions of people will notice is even worse. You will be actively selling bootleg merchandise. Sonichu has always been a rip-off of Sonic and Pikachu, two copyrighted characters owned by major video game companies. Nintendo, in particular, is known to harshly defend their copyrights, ordering the takedown of many fan projects under threat of legal action. Chris has managed to sail under their radar for years, not because they are unaware of him, but likely because they have concluded he is just a strange, overzealous fan. Unlike with fan-created games, there is no chance of Sonichu being mistaken for a genuine Sega or Nintendo product. For now, they see Chris's creations as posing no serious threat to their brands and thus simply not worth the hassle of dealing with through legal channels. However, they could always change their minds, especially if enough people start producing their own Sonichu junk. So why take the risk of getting struck with a bunch of crappy merchandise you're no longer allowed to sell? Besides, anything that wasn't made by Chris himself is not true and honest Sonichu merchandise. The only reason most Chris followers would even want something like a medallion is because it came from Chris himself. Chris himself has already filed a copyright removal request against Gino Samuel's YouTube channel over his Sonichu the Animated Series, which used Chris's artwork, resulting in the videos being taken down and Gino's channel receiving a copyright strike. Technically, you will be leeching money off of Chris. As sad as it is, Chris's Etsy store is probably the closest he can ever get to earning income completely by himself. By making and selling unofficial Solitude merchandise, you're depriving Chris of some of that money, which, whether we like it or not, it is technically money he is making, as painful as it is to say, and thus making it harder for him to do what other people have always told him to do, which is earn a living and stop leeching off government-related programs. The negative attention you will receive makes it not worth it. Self-explanatory, really, but let's talk about it anyway. Historically, Chris has always attracted the worst kinds of people, a bit like me. And that negative attention extends to anyone who becomes even tangentially involved with him. That doesn't include me, I think. Gino's documentary series is beloved by many Christorians, and even he received plenty of harsh criticism when he began selling his own line of Solitude medallions and other Chris merchandise. However, I don't think it's really slowed him down because, well, the documentaries have been made and, well, yeah, that was kind of like long before he started selling merch, I guess. Should Chris ever mention you, it could lead to you getting doxxed by Weens, your face being posted on the quickie for everyone to see, possibly even a Kiwi Farms thread. There are far better ways to eke out a few extra dollars online which don't involve painting a Chris-shaped target on yourself. As I mentioned before, the reason why we do things this way is because we're not involved. We are merely talking about it. And that's like the best way you can do it. It's a bit like when you see shows like The Great British Bake Off Extra Slice or The Apprentice You're Fired. It's like one of those shows that it's like an extra bit, but it's not involved in the show. Cast-offs, leftovers, or scrag ends. You can pretty much look at this. Chris Chan, A Comprehensive History, the Scrag Ends edition. And finally, you risk messing up your public understanding of Christery. By profiting off of Chris's story without giving a care for accuracy, and profiting off of what sounds nice, you risk creating mass confusion amongst the Quick sphere. Spooky Bones, noting how much attention the drama surrounding Chris's affair with his mother was receiving, decided to come up with as many juicy stories as she could surrounding the people that were in. Okay, well, that's very different, of course, if they were completely untrue, yeah. Only to then create a flurry of misconceptions and false views amongst the public. People later seem to have caught on to people potentially repeating what Spooky did, and have since then become far more careful about taking juicy information about Chris Chan they see online. This is evidenced by the incident surrounding Zella spreading the rumour about Chris impregnating Flutter, hoping that propagating the story would help draw more answers about Flutter's identity. Though the story initially caught traction, people became skeptical of it a week later and only brought negative attention onto Zella herself. And that, as they say, is that. And I really do mean it because that actually does bring us to the very end of the Unholy Quintet. From Wine Knights, A-Logs, Weens, Enablers, and Carpetbaggers. This is just a mere subsection of Christery now in the bag. Now, as I mentioned before, at the very start of this, part of me wanted to say this should be the Unholy Sextet, because technically trolling should be added to this. But at the same time, I think trolling is a little bit too much of its own identity, if you will. It's quite different from the things we mentioned. But in case you needed any accuracies in terms of, well, the sort of things that people fall onto when they talk about Chris or they try to get themselves involved, well, that should just about do it. Thankfully, however, as I mentioned numerous times throughout these sorts of articles, is that I don't consider myself a White Knight, an A-Log, a Ween, an Enabler, or a Carpetbagger. All I do is talk about Chris and give just some of my own opinions. Some of them I try to understand Chris's rationale. Other times I highly question it. And then I just talk about, the behaviors of others and how in the grandness of a second, almost a second opinion, if you will, just how it kind of looks. And sometimes it's the perception of things is what gets more people's attention. But if you think I do fall into any one of these categories, you best be prepared to give a reason why, because I can't think for one reason why I would defend Chris when, if Chris was legitimately the victim of something in any like modern circumstance, well, I usually have the opinion that there's two sides to this. Um, because of like the nature of just like how I make these videos, and even though I've done this for a while, I don't consider it A-logs because um it's not necessarily the sort of thing that we don't know already, so you can take or leave my videos, so it's not like it was ever going to become like massively popular and just keeping things low key in the way they are. It's you don't want to draw too much attention in thinking that you're something you're not. The reason I don't go under the title of Weens is because, well, with my face being out there and stuff like that, people will know immediately who's behind it, and yeah, it's not. Sometimes people, when they do try, they're under the impression they think they can get away with it forever, but unfortunately, nobody gets away with stuff forever. Even after they're dead, things come out, and that is that. And moreover, I don't certainly don't enable Chris. I don't encourage him because, quite frankly, considering how far we've come and the things I've talked about with Chris, from current events to now, it would be a really stupid idea to now say, yes, Chris should do it. And besides, I don't really feel like Chris needs my approval or my opinion. Chris will do what Chris wants, whether it makes sense or not. And I certainly don't go under the title of carpetbagger because I think the reason why I wouldn't, especially not the last one, is because the way I see other people do it and the ire and the problems it brings, it doesn't really seem worth it. So I think that, as they say, is that. So I hope all of you guys have enjoyed this little mini series, and normal servers hopefully should be resuming over the next couple of days. So I thank each and every one of you for coming with us and checking all these out, and I'll see you guys again next time. Thank you. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, in order to bring the Unholy Sextet, as I like to call it, to a close, we're sort of going to do a bit of a quick fire round tonight. And what do I mean by this? Well, because every single troll deserves an article in its own right, and they do, but what we're going to do is to sort of talk a little bit in very brief details about the sort of personas that have been fluid and active throughout the years. And much like everything else we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, don't get yourself involved, guys. It's never ever going to end well. So let's get to it. Pro tip. We're strongly recommending you do not try to troll Chris. Doing so risks you getting targeted and potentially doxxed. Note, any instance from the classic era trolls, such as the miscreants, that they were trying to help Chris is mostly tongue-in-cheek. Like with any other internet troll, their primary goal was to get a rise out of Chris. That which can condemn the abnormally foolish is not the abnormally clever. That which can condemn the abnormally foolish is the normally foolish. J.K. Chesterton. They are vicious, crazy, wickedly smart people. And what a world we live in, with such trolls in it. Trolls are various individuals of all races, colours and creeds, united under a common goal, to mess with the life of, and extract as many lulz from the internet's most beloved and most hated autistic man-child, Chris Chan, as possible. The organised efforts to troll Chris began in earnest back in 2007, and still has momentum going forward, even if it peaked after disbanding of the classic era trolls following the death of Chris's late father in 2011. Trolling schemes by these individuals have ranged from manipulating Chris into a Truman Show-like existence, making him rage on video, making him take pictures of himself unclothed, accelerating the breaking of his sense of reality, and more. Now, what you're going to take a look at, we'll go through these like one step at a time. pre-ed. It is notable that Chris was bullied in real life before his discovery by 4chan and ED. It can be argued that the first known torment of Chris occurred when his lifelong friend who no longer speaks to him, Sarah Nicole Hammer, locked him under the house where they were children. The next notable instance of bullying occurred during the infamous mini-date with Hannah in 2005, which smashed his heart level to 15%. Around the same time, he was also trolled by a girl he contacted through MySpace named Lindsay Kay. There was also possible trolling of Chris through the guestbook on his website from as early as 2003, when a hot redhead said she would meet him outside of PVCC. Either this was epic trolling, or Chris put it on the guestbook himself. And let us not forget about Mary Walsh and the gameplay's hijinks. But this was all child's play compared to what happened next. Bringing us up to what happened next. Y'all are making me very nervous right now. The Miscreants were a group of people who trolled Chris from 2009 up until his father's death in 2011. Clyde Cash was the original leader of the Miscreants, which was styled after the Patriots, a shadowy cabal from the Metal Gear series, who are revealed to be behind a conspiracy spanning decades, including all of the main incidents the protagonists go through. They claim to be responsible for several unfortunate events in Chris's past, which Chris seemingly believed. On the 23rd of February 2009, the Miscreants approached Chris in Mumble and informed him of their plan. Several "haha, I got you" videos were made, all with false information. In order to deal with these internet bullies, Chris resorted to babbling incoherently. I'm assuming, the days of threatening to make people in Soul Calibur 3 are long gone. After the disappearance of Clyde Cash, the site was down for a few weeks. Right, sorry, where was he? After the disappearance, on the 28th of June 2009, the Miscreants set up shop at the Private Villa of Corrupted Citizens message board. While online, wars have been waged, men in pickle suits have also been deployed to ruin Chris in reality. These exploits have included, but not limited to, stealing his date, obtaining potentially life-ruining material, and generally being nosy. They also seem to treat Chris's father, Bob Chandler, as one of their own. Considering that Bob was pretty much innocent throughout all of this, not 100%, but he was pretty innocent. He was a non-factor, really, apart from, being Chris's dad. While the group's explicit purpose, according to Chris, was to ensure that Chris never got laid and forever to remain a virgin with rage, that didn't stop them from sending a bunch of prostitutes to Chris's house. This is also why, ladies and gentlemen, you do not leak your home address over the internet. Because of stuff like that. Nonetheless, Chris got the last laugh when he hired a prostitute of his own. That's one way of going about it, I guess. I don't know. Since the death of Bob, however, the Miscreants have effectively disbanded, with pretty much everyone involved distancing themselves from Chris, and only a few, such as Surfshack Tito, continuing their efforts before eventually just sort of giving up and losing interest. Years after the fact, some have admitted they took things too far when reflecting on this era of Christery, whilst others look back on their sense of accomplishments with a level of satisfaction that can be considered relatively smug. Now, whilst a lot of people are certainly going to get articles of their own, because let's be honest, guys, there's a lot to cover here. What I can say, however, as we scroll through some of these, and it's interesting to know just sort of how we go from like 2009 to 2011, and then we sort of come towards some trolls that came about post 2011. Phaeton, Catherine, Jeff Francine, Jessica Quinn, etc. Then, the fantasy trolls. Beginning in October of 2017, the Idea guys exploited Chris's fantasy coping mechanisms in order to gain power over him. and numerous have jumped up on the scene throughout until you even get to the modern day ones. Presumably, modern day is what we're referring to by about 2020 onwards, such as Kawaii Sandbag, Lily, Solitude, and Rose Chew, which that's probably going to get an article of its own. That is definitely going to get edited out. Also, Devil Trolls, which I think, well, we may as well talk about them anyway whilst we're here. Aside from several notable figures above, the Devil Trolls are mysterious evil creatures that appear in Chris's Solitude comic series. These creatures are first mentioned in Solitude 9 and make their first appearance in issue 10. You know what? I don't care. Let's just move on anyway. They're not real. They're just sort of in the comics. Motivations. From Chris's perspective. Chris himself has a very simplistic view of what motivates his enemies. When a mailbag correspondent asked him to explain why he's trolled and why so many people seem to hate him, Chris had this ingenious response. They're just jealous that they did not think of Solitude first, or that I am more artistically talented than they are. Keep telling yourself that, Chris. You're the only one who believes that, my son. This is consistent with the advice given to many children who are harassed in real life, that bullies are merely jealous of you and want to see you react unfavorably, when in reality, bullies abuse others for many different motives, jealousy being only one of them. Furthermore, internet trolls typically do what they do for their own amusement, and not always out of some personal slight against their target. Since Chris never moved past high school mentally, he still believes he is hated because he is so much better than everyone else. From his own attempts to illustrate trolling, it's obvious that Chris has no concept of how it actually works. When he tried his hand at impersonation, he thought that we'd all be trolled if he pretended to be an epic troll, but then a troll saw through his lie and forced him to drop the ruse on pain of having his tugboat taken away. Because Chris somehow believed that somebody who was a troll claimed to also be working for for Sam's Club or for Inland Revenue or whatever it is the Americans have that distribute welfare. Chris believes that trolling has two steps. Pretend to be someone you're not and then troll someone by revealing who you really are. Sylvana, a character based on his perception of formed trolls, who claim to be people they aren't, think it's hilarious to pretend to be Meg Griffin, kiss Chris, and then transform once she's out of sight. As a result, Chris walks away happy, unaware that he's just kissed a transvestite. Or, well, transgender, I suppose would be the better way to put it. I only say that because I know that, again, these characters are not real, and Chris's exploration of certain themes is very, very thin-skinned, defeating the entire point of trolling him. A tool he has used to fight against his hatred of trolls is claiming that they are all homosexuals, combining his two major hates into one massive force of nature. The earliest this is seen is the message that he wrote in the mailbag section, exploding in rage over an added Twitter and how they could talk about him behind his back. Even more, in his Wikipedia article on the Wallflower, Chris has also decided that the trolls are also black. Yeah, you didn't read that wrong, guys. That's something that Chris legitimately thinks. Unsurprisingly, Chris also considers trolling a crime, and has somehow dedicated himself to stop trolling. However, Chris's views on trolling are also very skewed, as he believes that all trolling is equal to what he had done to him. In exclusive Manchester High School 2000 reunion Require Now, he told people how to act on the internet mere moments after revealing his real name, address, and phone number. As the years passed, Chris's take on trolls has erupted into a massive flight of fancy, because he has been refused admittance to the game place, and Chris has proclaimed that the entire store is a massive front for internet trolling, with Michael Snyder himself as the ringleader of all of it. He also sees the Quickie forums, Kiwi Farms, and Reddit as a major gathering place for trolls. This is despite the fact that, well, if Chris didn't keep responding to these sorts of things, then guess what? Why would he continue with this charade? This was something that was posed to him back in 2010, by the way, and Chris, for whatever reason, just didn't stop. His parents' perspective. The Matthew Noble call, which was also conducted by the troll who was Alec Benson Leary, in August of 2010, revealed some interesting insights into Bob and Barbara Chandler's interpretation of what has happened to their son over the years. Chris's parents are apparently convinced that the entire Chris Chan trolldom grew out of a conspiracy by Michael Snyder. Two alleged homosexuals who frequented the game place, possibly Lucas and Mims, and Megan Schroeder, who worked to get Chris banned from the store and are involved with a general effort to harass and torment Chris. When speaking with Ivy, Bob described Megan with words like cruel and German. Bob was convinced that it is all because they are persecuting Chris for being autistic, while in reality he was scaring away customers with his behavior and sexually harassing Megan. It's useful to try to consider things from his parents' point of view. To begin with, there is a worldwide conspiracy, more or less to pester the Chandlers, violate their privacy, drive their son to do ridiculous things, and otherwise mess around with him in a myriad of ways. Bob and Barbara are bombarded by prank phone calls all day, nude photos, God knows what else arrives in their mail, signs mysteriously appearing on their lawn, Chris having angry screaming matches with people they've never met on the telephone, Chris also once having to drive all the way to Ohio to meet a woman who didn't exist, and so on. Being Chris's parents must be a fairly surreal experience at this point, and given that they belong to a much older generation, they can hardly be expected to develop the grasp of internet social phenomena that they need to properly understand their situation. The gameplays, however, a small piece of the bigger picture it may be, is the most significant, real, physical element of Chris's adventures in trolldom that they've been exposed to. As ridiculous as their theory may seem, it's probable the best they can do as far as making sense of what has happened and continues to happen to them. And finally, Chris being a troll himself. But wait, I hear you ask. Doesn't Chris believe the idea that being a troll is accountable for, criminal and legal proceedings? Well, you're certainly right. However, while the idea of everyone's favourite man-child becoming the one thing he hates seems kind of far-fetched, if not laughably ironic, it actually isn't too far off as one might think. Because of his horrendous misconceptions of what he thinks his trolls do, Chris believes that, if given a new target, Chris's trolls would gladly stop attacking him and go after the new target. In the past, Chris has tried to deflect his trolls towards people like Joshua Martinez, Michael Snyder, and even Mims. However, Chris has been so entrenched with his trolls and viewers that the idea of going after someone else doesn't seem feasible anymore. As well, Chris has even attempted to troll his own trolls. One of his first known attempts was the rolling and trolling video, claiming that he had pulled the most epic prank on the internet, only to turn around the very next day and reveal that it was a lie. Solitude issue 10, as mentioned above, had his comic book self thinking he had kissed Meg Griffin, not knowing that it was actually Sylvana. As well, on the 28th of April 2012, he attempted to convince his trolls that he had gotten banned from the mall just before he decided to pull it. Interestingly, Chris's perception of being a troll is less about trolling to get a rise out of someone and more of attempting to pull a prank. His return to the love quest is probably the biggest indicator of this. Chris let his trolls know through his Facebook, then waited a day before shouting, "Surprise!" As well as he also believed that if someone reads his message, he's going to assume that everyone has and that they are going to descend on them all like a bad flash mob just to find Chris. Too bad, everyone, unlike Chris, has lives of their own. However, if there is one person that Chris himself has successfully trolled, without a shadow of a doubt, it's himself. Proof of this can be directly pointed to the bad habit of surrendering information about himself, no matter how embarrassing, demeaning, or downright stupid given whatever circumstance was surrounding the rationale at the time. Giving out said tidbits of himself would be. Chris often screams at his trolls for not leaving him alone, but aside from the fact that his antics only add more fuel to the fire, he always fails to realize that if he didn't give them ammunition to begin with, he wouldn't have ended up in this predicament. It just goes to show you, nobody trolls Chris better than Chris does himself. Chris is the very type of person not only to shoot himself in the foot, but reload, fire again, and repeat the cycle while blaming the trolls. Simply put, he simply never learns. But aside from this, his own relationship with the trolls. Although Chris will never ever admit it, Chris eventually developed something of a love-hate relationship with the trolls, which became clear during the Liquid saga. When Clyde trolled Liquid Chris in a phone call, Chris attempted to redirect Clyde to himself, angered by Liquid's slanderous attempt at stealing his trolls. In an email, I know, by the way, guys, I know that sounds, again, ridiculous once again, because why on earth would Chris be jealous about trolls going to someone? You would have thought, with how much harassment Chris received back in the day, he would have seen nothing more like it to finally, see the back of the trolls. I theorize this is because if it wasn't for the trolls, well, who would Chris actually, interact with at all? Genuine question, outside of his parents. In an email to Vivian, Chris also thanked the trolls for documenting the information he revealed to them and allowing him to mature emotionally, which also didn't happen. Although, and even Vivian G just straight up responded to this with, "You still haven't learned anything, have you?" And she was right. Although the trolls were a nuisance to Chris, their antics were far more thrilling than Chris's hopelessly shitty yet mundane lifestyle, which left him unfulfilled and desperate for adversity. The trolls served as black and white antagonists for Chris, giving him a perceived purpose in life and allowing him to live out his fantasies as a hero pitted against one-dimensional villains. This was likely a factor in Chris's susceptibility to trolling. Eventually, Chris's desire for a more exciting life of heroes fighting against villains was fully exploited by the idea guys and other enablers. As a result, Chris now believes that he already leads the same life as his fantasy counterpart, and has lost interest in traditional trolls. He even started thanking them for helping him discover his true self. And finally, today. Since the death of Chris's father, the loss of his home, and his plummet to the breadline, Chris has changed profoundly. No longer is he the naive, clown-shirted, indifferent, egotistical ED discovery in 2007. He is a jaded, chronically depressed, cross-dressing child trapped in an adult's body. That is, for all the world to see, is a physicality that resembles something of a skeleton rotting vertically and is rapidly going down. Who is not as susceptible to being capable of dealing with, and arguably as deserving of trolling as he used to be. Many of those who continue to follow his activities are beginning to opine that he has suffered enough, and that active trolling, even where it is successful, does not produce the results it used to. It takes more effort due to his inflated paranoia, and it tends to lead to small groups monopolizing Chris and hoarding the information they gather, as happened with Blanca and Catherine, and in some cases causes needless emotional damage to Chris. For example, the revelation that Chris's latest girlfriend, Catherine, was yet another troll persona in early November 2014 provoked disgust and disappointment, as many felt that not only was it unoriginal and no longer funny, but the trolls had spent weeks, if not months, stringing him along and toying with him, which included tricking him into grovelling for Catherine's continued affection. Many felt this amounted to emotional abuse of an already broken and miserable shell of a man. Some were even disappointed as they felt that after all Chris had gone through, he deserved to have a lucky break, and a real relationship for a change. Now, obviously, again, that's not what ended up happening because of almost what happened immediately afterwards, but it should be worth noting, even at this stage, ladies and gentlemen, even if we were to say Chris deserved to have a little bit of a break for once in his life, do you think Chris is the sort of person who would know better or know exactly what to do? Because, to be honest, Chris's reputation sort of stems on the back of nothing more than making extremely poor decisions. So, I'm not saying Chris shouldn't, but I'm just saying how long in reality do you think it would last? 2 months at the very most? I mean, let's say Chris, I don't know, won $150,000 on the lottery. How long do you think it will be before he pretty much spends all of it? Further, this was accompanied by the revelation that the same group of trolls had also fabricated Chris's denunciation by his high school friends, leading to many questioning the morality of impersonating Chris's old friends just to get a reaction out of him. And of course, the terrifying Orwellian nightmare that such trolling has left Chris in, as virtually every aspect of Chris's social life is engineered by trolls, and he has no way of knowing what or who is real, including his own family. Chris's transformation has also coincided with, and perhaps influenced, a shift in trolling. Active chronic trolling, such as Chris has experienced, is now generally looked down upon as weaning and attention whoring instead. As a result, it has become more fashionable to leave a lolcow like Chris to their own devices, for the most part, even post-arrest, such as him burning down his own house, and his various outings to Charlottesville and beyond, and many subsequent IRL bans. His bizarre dealings with Mary Lee Walsh, and of course the infamous incidents from Mike with hitting Michael Snyder and then macing a GameStop employee, all the way up into and including Chris too many games, being arrested for his affair with his own mother, and even recently getting kicked out of another convention, which he tried to adopt a disguise for to gain access. It can be argued that much, if not most, of the trolling that Chris has experienced since his discovery was possibly weaning as well. And whilst I think there's a lot to say about maybe that certainly is true, but what I'm just going to say is that if they really felt that strongly, then pretty much there would have been people involved who would have fought like demons to make sure that Chris was protected and stuff like that. Some may say the onus should have been on Chris, but one way or another, there's only so much hand holding you could do for Chris, because Chris is not your legal guardian. You may disagree with this, but the reality, insofar as I can see it, is that I'm about as responsible for Chris's actions and his livelihood as probably you are out there. So, what I'm going to say is that, well, like I said, the way to do this is just sort of how I do it. You merely observe it from an outsider looking in, but the important thing is that you stay on the outside and you don't become on the inside. Because I've seen too many examples, again, through A-logs and stuff like that, about what happens when you get too close. It means that there's somebody quite close behind and he's already putting a target on your back. But with all that being said, I will see all of you guys again next time. Thank you.